This video is going to explain how the North Korean leadership works by going through each of North Korea's leaders, as Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong Il, and Kim Jong Un. And my goal with this presentation is not to simply buy into the narrative that, oh, North Korea is crazy and irrational. Though they are crazy, I want to present North Korea as a state that is not insane, but often at times acts rationally. Now, none of that will be apologetics for their human rights abuses. It will not be saying, oh, they should definitely have a nuclear program, or, oh, a one-man state led by a totalitarian dictator is a great way to run a government. No, my argument instead is going to be that if you look carefully at what each of the three leaders have done, even probably the one that is most commonly seen as a bit of a joke, Kim Jong Il, though Kim Jong Un often gets his jokes as well because of the way he looks. But in any event, an examination of any of these three men is going to show someone who is a brutal man, someone who rules a country as a totalitarian dictator, but each of them are going to have things that they do that are going to reveal that they are acting in rational self-interest, at least at times. And so we're going to begin, of course, with Kim Il-sung, and we're going to have to spend a little longer on him because just in our last video where we explored every leader of China, the founding leader, Mao Zedong, took us a little extra time, and in order to understand the other two, we had to understand, in order to understand the subsequent leaders of China, we had to understand Chairman Mao. In order to understand the subsequent leaders of North Korea, we're going to have to understand the supreme great leader, Kim Il-sung. So let's get started with him. So to understand the birth of Kim Il-sung, we need to understand a little bit about where Korea is on the global stage in this moment in history, because Korea is a state, it is a unified state, but the Korean Peninsula sits in a very unique position. It sits between the country, or at times the dynasties of China, and in fact at the time of Kim Il-sung's birth, Korea is going to be sitting next to the remnants of the Qing dynasty, which around the time of his birth is going to officially dissolve into the Republic of China. And for hundreds of years prior, from the 14th century, it's going to be ruled by the so-called Ming dynasty that is going to make Korea and its Joseon rulership is going to be a vassal state of both the Ming and the Qing dynasty. So Korea, and this is important to understand, Korea is independent. It handles its own internal affairs. It's not necessarily part of the empire of China. It's not part of the empire of the Qing or the empire of the Ming before that. It is a vassal state to the suzerainty of the Ming or the suzerainty of the Qing. So let me write down the word suzerainty. Now it's important to understand that suzerainty is a way of describing the relationship between the suzerain and the vassal state. The suzerain is going to handle a lot of the foreign affairs. It's going to maybe offer military protection. It's not necessarily going to mess with the internal affairs of the vassal state, in this case, the Joseon Korean state, because what it really wants is supplication in the form of tribute. So when the Europeans start coming and trying to do relations with the Qing Empire, so for example, the British are going to actually get into a war over quote-unquote free trade with the Chinese in the 1840s, when some of these initial journeys are happening to meet the heavenly dynasty of the Qing Empire. Let me write down Qing so you know what I'm talking about. The Qing Empire the Qing dynasty, in China, which lasts from 1644 until 1912, though its dissolution is going to start before then. When the Europeans go, there's a lot of problems. They go to try to open up trade relations on equal footing with the Qing dynasty, and what they find is that they're expected to do things like the kowtow to the Qing emperor. It's this formal way of bowing, and the British and their emissaries find it offensive. Then they have these huge debates. If you read I believe it's Ottoman, the Heavenly Kingdom. You'll find these descriptions of how the European diplomats, the British diplomats that were sent to try to open up trade, they're gripped with debate about how to go about avoiding the kowtow to the emperor. And it's because the Qing dynasty is not going to accept anything other than full supplication as a vassal, effectively, of the Qing emperor. When describing what the Chinese would ideally like the British to be or how they'd like them to behave, they point to the Joseon dynasty that exists in Korea. And if I'm not mistaken, the Joseon dynasty exists from let me check my notes, make sure I get this correct. Yeah, the Joseon dynasty arrives in 1392, and it basically makes it to the end of the 19th century as effectively a vassal state of China. Now, some big changes are going to start taking place in this geopolitical area. The first change is that Japan is going to become much more aggressive in terms of building an empire. And the second thing that's going to happen is that the Qing dynasty, which has held on for centuries, or at least a little bit over 2 centuries, is going to begin to dissolve. Now, there's a huge threat to the Qing dynasty. There's a massive Chinese civil war, which we can't get into. The Qing dynasty is going to survive that, but it's going to basically take a slow decline up until the late 19th century and then going into the 20th century. 1912, it's actually going to break apart and become the Republic of China, that will be led at first by a revolutionary named Sun Yat-sen, who's going to work to bring the entirety of China together, and then later Chiang Kai-shek, who takes leadership in about 1936, 1937 of the KMT, the Kuomintang Party, and is going to fight the civil war with the Chinese communists, is going to eventually flee to Taiwan. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. First, we need to talk about Japan. Now, Japan is going to actually fight a war with the Qing dynasty over its influence in Korea. Japan basically wants to bring Korea into its sphere of influence. Let's call it that for now. So the balance of power is changing on the continent. There is something called the Sino-Japanese War. Remember that Sino, S-I-N-O, is the prefix in English for China, or Chinese. So this is the Chinese-Japanese War. It's going to last from 1894 till about 1895 and results in the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which is going to basically mean that the Chinese, who have lost the war decisively, the Qing Empire, which we've already established was quite weak, the Treaty of Shimonoseki is going to first make the Qing dynasty pay indemnities to the Japanese, so basically reparations, as though they were the ones that caused damage to the Japanese by having this war. But more important to the geopolitics of that era and eventually to our own era is that the Chinese are going to give Japanese the sphere of influence. They're going to formally say, okay, we put Korea out of our suzerainty. Korea is no longer our vassal state. Now, interestingly enough, this is also when Japan is going to gain control of the island of Taiwan from the Chinese. That's going to introduce about, 1945, so about 50 years or so of colonial Japanese rule over the island of Taiwan. And that's going to have a lot to do with the issues we see today where Taiwanese identity doesn't perfectly map onto Chinese identity when we're talking about the potential reunification of China and Taiwan. Japanese influence over Korea is going to culminate in a second war because there is another power we need to talk about, which is, of course, Russia. So we have the Russo-Japanese War, and that's going to last from only 1904 to 1905 with, again, a pretty decisive Japanese victory. It's going to be quite embarrassing to the Russians, and it's going to actually start to have impacts within the Russian state in terms of the legitimacy of Tsar Nicholas II. There's something called the 1905 revolution in Russia, which is going to be something that brings about lots of reforms within, or attempted reforms, from Pyotr Stolypin, I believe the prime minister, the head of the parliament that is created in Russia, to try to alleviate some of the need for reform within Russia. Of course, those reforms are going to fail, and eventually we're going to have the February Revolution during World War I, 1917, and then, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution a little bit later, which is going to lead to the creation of the Soviet Union, yada, yada, yada. Russo-Japanese War is going to end in 1905, and it's going to make Korea, for our purposes, Korea is going to become a protectorate of the Japanese Empire in 1905. And this effectively begins Japanese rule over Korea. Before then, we had an unequal treaty in 1875, 1876 that forced open trade in Korea in the Joseon Empire. Then we have the Treaty of Shimonoseki after the Sino-Japanese War that's going to create... It's going to eliminate the Qing's suzerainty over Korea, make it a quasi-independent state. And then we're going to have a period of about 5 years where Japan is going to slowly take this quote-unquote protectorate of Korea, and by 1910 is going to annex Korea into the Japanese Empire. So let's write that down. 1910, that's the year that Korea becomes officially not just a protectorate, but is annexed into the Empire of Japan. And this is going to have some consequences, not just in Korea, but also north of Korea. And I don't mean the state of North Korea, I mean in Manchuria, because the Japanese actually have eyes on building out their empire quite far. And I'm going to throw up a map right now that shows you like how far it went before they eventually lost World War II. So the first to fall under Japanese rule is Korea. But then in 1934, we actually have the Japanese create a puppet state in Manchuria that's just north of Korea. It's an area of China. It's going to be called Manchukuo. It's basically a Japaneseification of the Manchuria term, but effectively it's going to create this sphere of resistance along the Korean Peninsula and up and into Manchuria. And those who are resisting the Japanese Empire at this time are going to team up together. So you're going to have these overlaps of Chinese and Japanese resistance, Chinese and Korean resistance to Japanese imperialism in very interesting ways. Now, between 1910 and 1934, the protagonist of our story, which has taken us a couple minutes to get to, Kim Il-sung, is born. And he's born in 1912. So this is after the period of time when Korea has become a protectorate of under Japan and has actually been annexed into Japan in 1910. So he's going to be born into this situation in which Korea, the Joseon dynasty, is gone. Kim's family is not going to appreciate this very much. And we get a lot of hagiography later on. Hagiography is like basically the deification or the extra exaggeration of heroic stories in history for the purpose of propaganda. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's pretty obvious that Kim Il-sung's father was opposed to Japanese imperialism. And we can infer this not just from the stories that Kim Il-sung gives us in his autobiography, but from the fact that the entire Kim family is actually moved in 1919, 1920 out of Korea. They leave of their own volition. They leave this Japanese territory, and they actually go to Manchuria in 1920. Now, keep in mind, 1920 is before Manchuria is annexed into the Japanese Empire. So Kim and his family are going to go to Manchuria, that's part of China, in 1920, and they're going to participate in resistance to the Japanese from afar. Now, what does Kim Il-sung have to do with, what do we know about him in this period of time? Because he would have only been 8 years old in 1920. We really only have his word that he introduced, or that his father introduced him to anti-Japanese imperialism thought. That's totally believable, that he, serenaded him with bedtime stories or something in his younger years. And then we kind of have to skip ahead. There's a book that I want to reference for you called Accidental Tyrant. It actually just came out in 2025 by Fyodor Tertitskiy. And it's probably the most up-to-date biography of Kim Il-sung, the great leader of North Korea. And it's in that book that I found this anecdote that Kim Il-sung's middle school teacher is probably the first person to truly show anything to Kim Il-sung about Marxism-Leninism. we think we know that Kim Il-sung's father was perhaps a fan of Lenin's Bolshevism. We don't think that he was an ideologue. Neither was this teacher, actually. This teacher, we think, gave Kim Il-sung access to a pamphlet that was a description of a book written by Vladimir Lenin in 1916 while he was in exile, just before returning to Russia for the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. That book was called Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism. Let me make sure I got that title right. Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. That's a 1916 written, 1917 published book by Vladimir Lenin. Now, I've actually looked at this book. I've read it, not cover to cover, but I've read through it, and there's a couple little items in there that make it a fascinating book for it to be the first exposure of Kim Il-sung, soon to be a Stalin-esque figure of global communism, to have read. And the first thing is that it does have a little bit to say about Korean independence. That is, that Lenin, somewhere within this book, says that, Korea, since it has not been an imperialist country, should be able to be independent and not be a vassal of a communist state, should have a proletarian revolution because it has not subjected other countries to imperialism. The second thing, which is more important, is that it is, at its core, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Just as Lenin is an anti-capitalist, he is an anti-imperialist. And for Vladimir Lenin, anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism are one and the same. We often think about imperialism in political terms. So we think about the Athenian Empire prior to the Peloponnesian War that was expanding territorially and imposing itself politically on other countries. We think of the British Empire sailing the seas, right? But this is when, actually, that mercantile era is when we have to start to consider a second aspect of imperialism, which is its economic consequences. And in Marx's theory, imperialism is itself a function of industry, capitalist industry, ownership within a country, basically reaching the upper bounds of that country. So maximum saturation in a capitalist country like Britain would then lead those companies, and in turn the state, to seek new markets and new places to, first of all, get raw resources for capitalism, and eventually to actually outsource some of the industry itself that makes those raw materials into commodities. And so for Vladimir Lenin, in this 1970 piece, The Highest Stage of Capitalism, you have this cyclical relationship between the imperial power and those within its imperial sphere. That is, that capitalism itself is exported as part of this political push to new territory. It's then, those raw resources are then re-imported into the head of the empire, so back into London if you're the British Empire. Eventually, though, the factories themselves that are in the United Kingdom are going to be exported out into other countries so that the labor that's necessary to do those can be done cheaply, and therefore the capitalist class can keep more profits for themselves. Okay, I probably butchered the theory a little bit, but I hope you get the general idea that what Lenin is talking about is, if you remember nothing else, imperialism bad. And presumably, if this pamphlet that Kim Il-sung's middle school teacher gave him was a general summary of Lenin's work, he would have seen the 2 points. One, that Lenin thought Korea could be an independent proletarian state after the Workers' Revolution, and two, that Vladimir Lenin thought imperialism bad. And that's probably what motivated Kim Il-sung to become a communist, though we don't know for sure. That being said, this is the most that we really get about Kim Il-sung's communist education. He doesn't study the works of Marx. We have no evidence that Kim Il-sung ever actually studied the works of Marx. We have no evidence that Kim Il-sung actually engaged in Marxist-Leninist theory at any point in his life, other than what he delegated out to his underlings or the things that he said in speeches that were presumably written for him. Basically, we have no evidence. What I'm trying to say is that we have no evidence that Kim Il-sung was like a devoted true believer. And that does distinguish him from the likes of Mao Zedong and of Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, the Castros, Fidel Castro in Cuba. These are people who, at their base, seem to have truly believed in the project, at least at some point. Now, they bended it to their will. They bended it for their practical purposes. Stalin would come out with a theory of socialism in one country, even though theoretically the workers' revolution in communist philosophy, or communist thinking, should be a global revolution of the workers, almost like a domino of revolutions. That wasn't happening, and so into the 1930s, Stalin begins to propagate this theory of socialism in one country. Conveniently, that probably helped to keep him in power because it helped to explain why the things that were predicted by Marx and Lenin and Trotsky weren't happening. And especially Trotsky, it's important for Joseph Stalin to say why Trotsky bad and not a smart guy. Chairman Mao. We talked in my last video a little bit about Chairman Mao's modification. Maoism on top of Marxism-Leninism was the idea that there is no great... In general Marxist thinking, the proletarian revolution is the working class revolution that takes place after a country has industrialized, and you have a working class to learn about class consciousness and eventually to perform revolution. The problem for Mao is that China, at the time of their communist revolution, which is really a rolling thing from the 1920s until they take power in 1945. The problem there is that China isn't really industrialized. I mean, they have some industrialization going on, but the vast majority of China is rural peasants, right? So what do you do in that circumstance? The Soviet Union had their answer to that question. China had its answer to the question, and the answer from Chairman Mao was that the revolution should be peasant-led, bottom up. We don't really have any evidence that Kim Il-sung did any of this deep thinking. We will eventually get to his Marxist theory of Juche in 1955, but spoiler alert, Kim Il-sung's variation on Marxism is a bit of a gobbledygook to justify his one-man dictatorship. And you, of course, cynically could argue that others were like that, but the distinction I'm making here is that Mao, Stalin, they believed in what they were doing. Sung, I don't think he was an ideological communist at any point, for real. Okay, I had to clear the board and wipe some sweat off my brow. I'm doing this all in one take, so you'll have to excuse me if there's a couple awkward cuts where I have a brain fart or need to do a little clearing here. Remember that Kim Il-sung is going to be exposed to some of the ideas of communism after his family is moved to Manchuria in 1920. Between 1920 and 1921 or 1929, we have a little bit of a black box for Kim Il-sung because he's going to basically reemerge in 1929 onto the historical paperwork, sort of. Like historians, generally speaking, they work with documents, right? So if something's not actually documented somewhere, it's a little hard to prove. Well, we have evidence that Kim Il-sung shows back up in 1929 because he is arrested, and he spends some time, 5 months in fact, in jail as part of being a member of the Communist Youth League in Manchuria. Now, according to the evidence we have, Kim Il-sung basically joined in 1929 and basically got arrested right after. It kind of sucks, right? He got inducted into the party. He's become a revolutionary over the last decade since moving to Manchuria. And then he's coming of age, 1929. He would have been 17 or 18 then, right? Well, he gets arrested and he spends 5 months in prison. He has gotten out of prison. Remember, he's arrested for basically being a violent communist against Japanese imperialism. But this is actually before Kim Il-sung, that as far as we know, actually begins to perpetrate acts of violence against Japan. This is an era when Japan is simply meddling in Manchuria, and the resistance is going down into Korea to try to resist Japanese imperialism, which since 1910 has annexed Korea. However, some interesting things are going to now take place. First of all, Kim Il-sung is going to formally join the Communist Party in 1931. Some sources have it at 1932. That's really thin. Let me see if I can write that a little thicker with 2 C's. 1931. That looks better. So he joins the Communist Party. But which Communist Party does he join? The Korean Communist Party doesn't exist. Kim Il-sung is not living in Korea. He's living in China. The Communist Party that Kim Il-sung joins is the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I've said that melodramatically, not because I think it's like a big scandal or something, it's logical, but because Kim Il-sung is going to eventually make a lot of effort to erase the fact that he has lots of links to China. And he's also going to eventually develop links with the Soviet Union. He's going to do a lot of effort, Kim Il-sung is, to also erase the Soviet Union's impact on him and its way of bringing him into power. Because in the end, it's basically Joseph Stalin that does it. Kim Il-sung doesn't want you to know that. He definitely doesn't want his people knowing that he joined the Communist Party of China. That's weird. He's actually going to later on claim that from the 1930s on, he is leading a Korean Revolutionary Army against Japanese imperialism that is going to eventually result in riding to victory in 1945 and the creation and liberation of North Korea. I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves, though. 1931 is when Kim Il-sung becomes what is called, and this isn't like an official title, he's just a guerrilla fighter. And often when you see biographies of Kim Il-sung, I assume if you pulled up Wikipedia, which is a wonderful thing, the greatest source of intellectual altruism in human history, if you pulled up Wikipedia, I'm sure one of the very first things about Kim Il-sung would be that he was a guerrilla fighter from like 1930 to 1945 resisting Japanese imperialism. Very true. He did that, though, within the the Chinese Communist Party. And he is going to become basically a military man. And they're going to have lots of setbacks. But this is the part of Kim Il-sung's biography that is, like, it's over-exaggerated in North Korea's official history. There's no need for it to be. The guy was out there fighting Japanese imperialism. There's no need to like hide the fact that he was collaborating with other anti-imperialist forces. In fact, if he was truly a communist, you'd say that nation states themselves are arbitrary functions of feudalism that then become capital countries, and then eventually you have your socialist revolution and the takeover of the workers. It's an international movement. And the International Comintern is set up, I believe, in 1919 by Vladimir Lenin to have international communism. So in the communist way of thinking, there's no shame in being like internationalist. In fact, that's the point. But we're going to find out later that Kim Il-sung is at his heart, like I said earlier, a nationalist and not really a communist, except when the language is just suitable to him because he set himself up that way. But there's a wee problem that we need to address, and that is that the Chinese communists start to become suspicious of the Korean communists among their ranks. They start to become suspicious that Koreans like Kim Il-sung are actually secret ploys sent by the Japanese to undermine the Chinese independence movement. And this becomes particularly poignant after Manchuria becomes an officially annexed part of Japan, of the Japanese Empire, under the name of Manchukuo, which is, okay, just a puppet state and a Japanesization of the word Manchuria. So we don't need to labor too much on the existence of the Manchukuo state, though if you need to Google this later, you should Google that and not Manchuria. 1934, a couple years later, 1936 to I believe 1939 or so, there's going to be a series of purges within the Communist Party of China to root out some of these Korean infiltrators who are secretly working for Japan. Now, this is not going to affect Kim Il-sung, but is going to weaken the Korean influence within the Communist Party of China generally. And that is going to be then worsened by the fact that the Japanese are making pretty steady gains at fighting these resistance fighters. So the Japanese Empire is not just taking all of this resistance and guerrilla fighting and violence being perpetrated against it in its new imperial territories. It's not taking that lying down. The Japanese are going to push back. And in fact, they're going to basically nearly eliminate the group that Kim Il-sung is fighting with. And in 1940, Kim Il-sung is actually going to, his commanding officers killed in 1939. In 1940, Kim Il-sung is going to go to the place that is going to really make him the powerful man that we know him to be. He's going to go meet the Soviets. Did you hear that right? I'm moving the mic a little bit. He's going to go meet the Soviets. So he and the group that remains, which has been decimated. Des actually means 10. So in theory, the word decimation means reduced by 10%. But no, they were reduced by 90, 95, 99%. And they basically flee from Manchuria, where they've been perpetrating this Japanese resistance, they're going to go to the Soviet Union. Now, look at the timeline here. 1940. Anything else going on in the world in 1940? There's this little doodly in history. I don't know if you've heard of it. I made that joke before. I'm very sorry. World War II. Now, World War II is generally considered to have begun in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Recently argued that if you consider the full invasion, the full-scale invasion of Japan into China, Japan is going to be one of the Axis powers. China is going to be one of the Allied powers. If you consider that Japan fully invades China in 1937, maybe we should make an argument that World War II started in 1937. If you consider the fact that basically all of the powers that would be relevant in World War II are involved in Spain during their civil war in 1936 and 1939, maybe it started then. Okay, let's not get too lost in that. I got to make a whole video on the Spanish Civil War sometime. You can see that by 1940, World War II is a thing. It is going on. And when these Korean revolutionaries, these guerrilla fighters, get to the Soviet Union, the Soviets don't really know what to do with them. And in fact, in the first couple years, when Kim Il-sung and his fellow revolutionaries are in the Soviet Union, they're actually placed in camps while the Soviets try to figure out, are they legit? Who are they? Do they actually believe in the cause, or are they sent here as some sort of a scam? But the exigencies of the Soviet Union's position are going to force a change to that attitude very quickly. Some of you know that there's a little guy in history, is a bit of an obscure name. You might have heard of him. His name is Hitler. If you've never heard of him before, Google it. He had a, well, fascinatingly interesting life, and it's not just painting. He did lots of other things, a lot of them terrible, just to make sure that you don't think I'm joking too much. So Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941. That is going to create some exigencies for the Soviet Union. First and foremost, it's going to mean that they need to start to defend themselves. So all of these Soviet forces that are in the eastern part of the country, that are in Manchuria, that are fighting close to the border of Manchuria, that are defending this part of the Soviet Union, they're going to start to be pulled away. They're going to start to be pulled away to places like Stalingrad. They're going to be pulled away to the west. That leaves some pretty difficult choices for the Soviet leaders that are in the eastern part of the country at this time. And they basically come up with a decision that they're going to start to replace some of the soldiers that are departing with whoever the heck they can get. So they've got this big old group of Korean fighters in camps in Siberia, and they say, I wonder if we could actually have them go and make up some of our eastern defenses. And eventually, of course, very, very late into World War II, the Soviet Union is going to declare war on Japan. They actually haven't done that yet. And eventually these Koreans that are sent to the eastern flank in Manchuria are going to actually become part of the invasion force to retake North Korea. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me just say that in 1942, Kim Il-sung reemerges in Manchuria, and eventually he's going to go all the way down to North Korea until it's liberated. And he's going to do so as a captain in the Red Army. So he is going to officially become, he's going to put on the Red Star. In fact, when he first emerges as North Korean leader, later he's going to insist on continuing to wear this Red Star. He is going to join the Soviet Union's army. Again, something that Kim Il-sung is later going to try to erase from his personal history when it's rewritten as part of his cult of personality in North Korea. Kim Il-sung was part of the Communist Party of China, spoke pretty good Mandarin. He also spoke pretty good Russian. He joins the Red Army as a captain, and that is what he is going to be until the end of World War II in 1945. It's actually kind of incredible when you think about it. He is the most cosmopolitan communist leader, right? Like you think about Stalin, he was involved in the Bolshevik Revolution. He was, under Lenin, and he, connived his way to the top after the death of Lenin over Leon Trotsky. Think of Mao, diehard communist within China, right? Might have given a little nod to internationalism, but at his heart was, Chinese, spoke with a really thick accent from where was Mao Zedong from? I can't remember. Somebody in the comments tell me. There was a lot of effort in Mao's later life to even understand what he was saying, because as he became sick and elderly, it was like only one of these women that was functioning as his nurse and previously had been like his concubine that could even understand what he was trying to say as he mumbled out with this thick rural accent. So he's China through and through. Stalin's Russia, or Soviet Union, through and through. Kim Il-sung, though, he's born under Japanese rule. I don't know if he spoke Japanese, but he eventually goes to Manchuria and he speaks Chinese. He's educated presumably in Mandarin or in a dialect of Chinese. Then he goes to the Soviet Union. He's fluent in Russian, and in fact later on he's going to be chosen and selected by the Soviet leadership to be their man, their puppet man basically, in Northern Korea, because of the fact that he's got all these links to the Soviet Union in particular and speaks pretty good Russian. By the way, when he joins the Red Army as a captain, he's part of something called the 88th Separate Rifle Division. Sometimes it's called infantry. I think that's a translation thing. Just depends on which biography and which source you're using, but he's part of a division, the 88th. Why the 88th? I think it's because they replaced something that already had that name. There's no true significance. There weren't like 87 other Korean divisions. He was part of the 88th Separate Infantry Division as a captain within the Red Army. When the war is over, Korea is divided in two spheres. It's divided into the north and the south for purposes of occupation. So don't make the mistake of thinking that when the Allied powers, victorious in World War II, decided to split Korea, that they meant to do so permanently. The idea at the first, when you think of what Stalin had in mind, what the Americans, the British, the French had in mind, places like Yalta, what they were arguing for Korea is that it be temporarily divided in the same way that Berlin was supposedly temporarily divided into Allied sections, in the way that Germany was divided into East and West, theoretically temporarily. They decided to split Korea in that same way with the view to unifying the country again. There was a decision by the Allies that Korea would be made an independent country after Japan was defeated. However, as we know, that unification never happened. At least it hasn't happened as of now, as I'm recording this in the 2020s. In 1945, September 1945, Kim Il-sung is sent back to Korea for the first time. Now, keep in mind, he's been involved in skirmishes and fighting, but this is really his first time spending a sustained amount of time in Korea since he was moved there with his family in 1920. So he definitely speaks Korea. He's probably a little bit, uncomfortable with his homeland. And when he goes up to give a speech in October of 1945 for his first time as this chosen leader of what would be the North, he insists on wearing his red star from the Red Army. And in fact, he's mistaken. Kim Il-sung is a name that is that actually has a couple predecessors within Korean history, and so some people don't even think that that's the right Kim Il-sung up there on stage, or that he's like an imposter or something. So he makes a pretty awkward entrance into North Korea, or the northern occupied portion of the Korean peninsula, after World War II. But like I said, the reason he was chosen was not because of his great credentials as a Korean. He was chosen because he was probably palatable. They presumed he was palatable to the Koreans. He was chosen because he had these links to the Soviet Union and had fought as a captain in the Red Army. And he was chosen because everyone else kind of sucked. Let's just be real. There was no other grand candidate out there. There's, descriptions in Accidental Tyrant and a couple other places where you can find descriptions of like the selection process. It wasn't particularly elaborate. There was another guy who was considered for the job and he just kind of sucked. The Communist Party of Korea is reborn in August of 1945 by Pak Hon-young. Let me write that down. He's an important figure. Pak Hon-young. let me make sure it's a O. My last video I did, Hua Guofeng got the wrong letter in his name for like 5 minutes. Yeah, with an O. Pak Hon-yong is an ideological communist, and he rebuilds the party in August of 1945, but that's a little late. Remember, Kim Il-sung is sent back in to Korea in September of 1945. So, yeah, 1945. I think I might have just said 1948. So it's a little too late for this guy who's like a genuine communist. He might have been the only other true contester to power, and we're going to see later on that Kim Il-sung's also going to consider him that way, a threat to his power. He's basically going to enter the race too late, and so he's not chosen either. So it's Kim Il-sung, the so-called first secretary. So by the end of the year, Kim Il-sung is the officially Soviet-sanctioned leader of the North. 1946, something that plays out in lots of different places around the Eastern Bloc and in China, and of course a little later in China after the end of the Civil War. But also happens here in Korea is that there is a Sovietization, basically, of the areas that are occupied or under the Soviet influence. So that means a focus on heavy industry. That usually means also a Stalinist-style land reform. So heavy industry. Remember, in communist and Marxist thinking, Marxist-Leninist thinking, in order to get to communism, what you need is industrialization, capitalist industrialization, functionally. Then, when that country or place has a working class, as a result of that industrialization, you raise their consciousness. They take power, a proletarian revolution, to seize the means of production. They build a utopian socialist society. They build socialism from each according to needs. No, from each according to ability to each according to needs. Sometimes that phrase is remixed a little bit depending on who is doing the writing. But when the socialist state falls away because socialism is perfectly distributing according to needs, then you have communism. So what does that mean in the context of Korea? Why would you start heavy industrialization right after the end of World War II? It's because you're starting to build socialism. And the way to build socialism is to industrialize. There's another thing that goes on, and that is you need to have the eventual collectivization of agriculture. And the way this is done in the Soviet Union, in China, and in Korea is that at first, the land is not collectivized. At first, the land is expropriated from the land-owning class. So in Northern Korea, the land is forcibly taken from the land-owning class. This is basically copying, pasting what happened in the Soviet Union. And the landowning class is not compensated, and then the land is distributed to the peasants, to the peasant class. There's no working class, but to the peasants. This is something that's going to happen in after 1949 in China under Mao Zedong. There's going to be a land reform period where there's expropriation, lots of violence. Eventually in China, there's collectivization in 1956. The same thing is going to happen earlier in Korea. Eventually these areas that have been expropriated from the landowning class are going to be collectivized into big collective farms. And as happened in the Soviet Union and eventually China, it's not going to go that great in North Korea. However, it is going to actually, at the time, contemporarily look pretty good. There is a similar land reform going on in the South, because remember, the north of Korea, the north of the Korean Peninsula is occupied by the Soviets. The south of the Korean Peninsula is occupied by the Americans. This is something that's been sort of lost to history, is that the first decades of South Korea were kind of crap. There was a military dictatorship that people really did not like. And it's actually not until the late 80s, we're going to get to that a little later, that South Korea begins to really look like the shining star, this economic miracle, this burgeoning and emerging liberal democracy. That's not going to exist at this time. And at this time, the land reforms that are passed, and we have American sources describing this, and of course we have just the promulgated laws of the authorities in Southern Korea. The way that they're going to go about land reform is by means of attempting to fairly compensate landowners and then sell the expropriated land to lower class or peasant farmers at fair rates. And what really happens is that South Korea pisses off everyone with this policy. And it's really the landowning class that is helping to hold up the South Korean authorities, and they're not going to like the idea of land reforms. The reason that South Korea is doing it is because of how popular it looks in the North. And remember, at this time, there's free movement for the most part. There's ways to compare. There's information going back and forth, people going back and forth, ideas being exchanged. And there's even the idea, and there's attempts being made in conference with the victorious powers and with the Korean people to eventually unify the North and South into some sort of a provisional unified state. So there's no hiding what's going on in either of the two countries at this moment in time. Today we think about a complete dearth of information from North Korea. That's absolutely not the case in the 1940s, after 1945. People knew what was going on, and things that were going on in North, like the land reforms, were looking very appealing to people in the South. They were demanding these sorts of things, but then the stakeholders involved, the landowners, had a lot more power in the South than in the North, and so it ended up helping the delegitimization of the South Korean authority. While I'm clearing the board here, I did just want to say that the period 1930 to 1945, in terms of what would eventually become the stories of Kim Il-sung's life, these are what I would call the myth-making years. So these are the years that are going to be rewritten when Kim Il-sung has ultimate power in North Korea. So, for example, he's not obviously going to be sold as a member of the Chinese Communist Party or as someone who was part of the Red Army under the Soviet Union. He's going to be sold as basically someone who exists for over a decade fighting the Japanese directly. And he is going to be this liberator. And in fact, in a few decades, his son is going to be making movies, propaganda films for North Korea. And there's this repeated pattern in the movies in which the protagonist is going through tough times. Maybe they're under the yoke of the Japanese imperialists. And then the magical, heroic Kim Il-sung comes to rescue. So there's this very famous film made by Kim Jong Il, the son of Kim Il-sung, called The Flower Girl. I believe it's 1972. Kim Jong Il being the only North Korean leader and really the only communist dictator that I'm aware of to have an IMDb page. Anyway, The Flower Girl is a story of a girl who's under Japanese imperialism. And lo and behold, eventually she... I can't recall the exact plot, but she's devoted to the idea of Korean independence, and eventually Kim Il-sung rides in to save the day on his horse. And the image of Kim Il-sung on a horse is also going to be a huge part of the cult of personality around Kim Il-sung. Ironically, there's a Chinese word about riding in on a horse or something that is basically the seed of the idea. Of course, again, nothing like that is going to be associated later on. It's going to be erased from the history. Whenever you see Kim Il-sung on a horse, you never want to say, oh, that reminds me of some imagery from China. No. That's a great way to get purged. 1945 to 1948, there are parallel authorities going on in North and South, and there's basically a very obviously failed attempt to reunify North and South Korea. And this is a period of time, there's this little window of time after World War II in which the Soviet Union and the Americans are still considering themselves allies, and they don't quite know what to make of each other. And there's wings within both places that are more or less favorable to working together again and to try to collaborate on things. But it's pretty obvious early on, for example, in the formation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in, that the Soviets are going to start to play by different rules. I don't want to pass judgment here because we're trying to do explanation, but there is a sense that relations between the US and Soviet Union begins to break down. You have things like the Berlin blockade, you have the occupation starts to become more hostile in Eastern Europe, and there's a fear that really if the Soviet Union wanted to just run over Western Europe and take it, that the US military is, they're already leaving and redeploying in other places. Like the Soviet Union could take Western Europe if they wanted to. And there's this fear that like Stalin is going to become the imperialist conqueror of Europe. And there's a genuine fear from the West that's going to take place. This plays out in Korea too. So basically, there is an accepting of reality. In September of 1948, I believe it's September 8th of 1948, let's write that correctly, the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is declared. And it's declared only a couple weeks after the Republic of Korea is declared. So there's now an acceptance that there are two entities. And they basically both want to conquer the other. We're going to have a couple years of threats from both sides before the Korean War begins. But there is a tacit acknowledgement of the reality of the situation after World War II. In about 1948, when the two authorities of North and South become actual proto-states, quasi-governments. And this is when Kim Il-sung's power is going to start to accumulate, because he's not only going to be the first premier of the DPRK. Now think of the premier as the head of government. He's not only going to be the first premier of the DPRK, but he's also going to be the first chairman of the Korean Workers' Party Politburo. So the Korean Workers' Party, KWP, it's Politburo. So he's going to be in charge of not just governance, but also the party itself. And if you know your communist history, you know that lots of these premier paramount leaders of communist states, they add titles together in a way that gives them control over the state, over the party, and the last leg of that three-legged stool is the military. So you'll often have them be the chairman of the Central Military Commission. And in fact, Kim Il-sung is, I don't know if he's going to give himself that title, but his son and then his grandson are going to take that title. And they're going to have this trifecta. Mao does it, Stalin does it. They collect the different, let's call them pillars of government. There's no separated equal branches or anything, but they're going to take these three pillars of government and they're going to put themselves at the top of each one of them. And that is how they're going to have ultimate control. Remember, each of these men are going to have cult of personalities. They're going to have totalitarian control. But if I didn't say it before, I'm going to say it now. The totalitarian cult of personality that Kim Il-sung builds is the most totalitarian of them all. By comparison, somehow Stalin and Mao look a little liberal next to Kim Il-sung because of his special breed of totalitarianism. And in fact, other wannabe totalitarians from like Eastern Europe, from like the Soviet bloc, I think one of the communist leaders from like Albania goes at some point to North Korea and sees the cult of personality being built by Kim Il-sung and is like, holy crap, this is something, man. And not to get too hyperbolic, but I actually think in some ways Kim Il-sung's totalitarianism starts to flirt with like the totalitarianism found in 1984 from George Orwell. And of course, Orwell in that was trying to describe the effects of Stalinism. But if you think about like the Big Brother is watching you posters everywhere, and then you go to North Korea and literally every home there has to be a very pristinely kept, perfectly dust-free picture of Kim Il-sung. And in fact, it's like government policy that if there's, you know, dust on it, that's like a crime against the state and a crime against the dear leader or the great leader. You can start to see how the comparisons to 1984 are much more justified. In not to say that there's nothing to see in Stalin's Soviet Union, you wouldn't want to be there, especially during the purges, just to say that like Kim Il-sung is going to take this cult of personality to another level. I'm losing my light a little bit, so I'm going to set the mic down and turn on a light to make sure that I'm well illuminated. I'm just here, you know, sharing some knowledge with you. So if the light goes out or it's not perfect, hopefully the sound is good enough to keep your interest. Okay, I turned on a light. I rolled up my sleeve. I was getting a little warm. My last video, I sweat through my shirt. I put on an undershirt for this one to try to remain presentable as I went along. So we were talking about the late 1940s. A couple other important things start to take place. In 1948, Kim Il-sung merges the Communist Party of North Korea and the Communist Party of South Korea. So the southern part of Korea is evolving into a military dictatorship. Communism is not going to be allowed there. In fact, the dictator is going to start to have agitators against, on the street, basically street thugs that are fighting who they perceive as communists. And so the Korean Party of North Korea and the Communist Party of North Korea, the Communist Party of South Korea are going to basically merge into one, simply the Korean Workers' Party. And again, Kim Il-sung is going to be the very tippy top of that. But this is also a period in which there is a desire, really on both sides of the 38th parallel, to reunify Korea. So it's been divided because of World War II, but there's no one really who thinks like, oh, this should be permanent. And about the unification took place of the parties in 1949. 1949 and 1950 is also the period when Kim Il-sung is going to start agitating in Moscow to Daddy Stalin, please, oh pretty please, can we invade the South under my leadership and unify Korea? Because remember, Kim Il-sung is not a liberal, not really a communist, or doesn't really seem to be a true believer in communism, but what is he? He's a nationalist, and he wants the Korean nation to be one. And what eventually we are going to call the Korean War is called the Fatherland Liberation War in North Korea. Who are they liberating it from? Well, the capitalists and the imperialists, right? All of this goes back to that pamphlet, right, about Lenin, imperialism, the highest age of capitalism. All that language is going to be appropriated by Sung. So the national liberation of the fatherland, right, it's all wrapped up in the language of anti-imperialism, and that is going to be the through line for Sung's entire life. Now, Kim Il-sung is going to go to Moscow a couple different times, and he's going to ask Joseph Stalin, hey, it'd be great if we could invade the South. It'd be great if you would help me invade the South. Now, there's good reason why the timing is actually quite good. Keep in mind that after 1945, the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Chairman Mao picks back up. That ends in the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, the ejection of the nationalists from China, the victory of the communists in 1949 under Mao Zedong. China's communist revolution culminates in a unified communist China. So Kim Il-sung sees this, and this is in 1949, right? By 1950, he's poking Stalin. He's saying, hey, if the Chinese can do it, why can't the Koreans do it? Now, Stalin, for his part, he's playing it a little coy. Stalin is balancing a lot of different things here. Now, first of all, Stalin is balancing his relationship with the USA. He's trying, though it's kind of strange. Stalin has this sort of fatalistic belief that the Soviet Union and the USA will eventually end up going to war with each other, but he also doesn't seem to want to bring that about too quickly, because remember, the Soviet Union is developing its own nuclear weapons program, and I believe their first test is 1948, 1949. But in any event, Joseph Stalin isn't in a big hurry for the nuclear holocaust, even though he seems to ideologically, as a Marxist, believe, there will be eventually a fight between the Soviet Union, the great Soviet Union, and the great United States. So all that to say, he's not interested in sending the Red Army to Korea to help liberate the South at the behest of Kim Il-sung. What Stalin wants is for Chairman Mao Zedong in China to basically do his dirty work for him and go help Kim Il-sung take South Korea. And he tells Kim Il-sung, go ask Mao. So it's like, go ask your father, go ask your mother, get away from me. And Kim Il-sung goes to Mao and he says, hey, listen, Stalin he doesn't want anything to do with he doesn't want to intervene personally. He doesn't want Soviet troops in Korea, but he has offered like air coverage. He's made some like half-hearted promises about this or that. I just want to get your permission basically to invade South Korea. I don't want your help, Chairman Mao. I won't need it. I promise. That's a guarantee that's going to come back to bite Kim Il-sung in the butt pretty quickly. But basically, Chairman Mao hears this. He hears Kim Il-sung saying, hey, Stalin told me to ask you, and it's going to go great. I don't need your help, but like, could you just sign off on it? So Stalin says yes. And Chairman Mao is like, they actually like send a telegram to Moscow, and they're like, is this true? Is this like, are you cool with an invasion of South Korea? He doesn't actually trust Kim Il-sung. And I guess this maybe goes back to some of that inter-fighting between the Chinese communists and the Korean communists back in the 30s. Anyway, a telegram comes back from Moscow, and Stalin's like protecting his image as like the man above the other communist leaders, right? Stalin's the granddaddy of the communist bloc, and he doesn't want to tell Mao, I'm too weak or I'm unwilling, but instead he says, I think what I would say is that yes, the Chinese comrades and the Korean comrades had come to a decision together. Signed, Stalin. So he doesn't guarantee help. He doesn't really do anything other than say like, well, I'm going to stand up on high and recommend you guys figure it out. Well, they do. At this point, Mao says, fine. And I've got lots of books that I'm going to recommend towards the end of the video that kind of go into some of the details here. There is a lot of back and forth in the sources about who said what to who visited when, etc. But we don't need to get into that here. The point is that there is a decision made that the Great Fatherland Liberation War should take place. And up until it really kicks off in 1950, it's an open question who's going to invade who first. Is the South going to invade the North first? Is the North going to invade the South first? The answer is the North is going to invade the South first. And in fact, the invasion is going to go so well that Seoul, the capital of the South, is going to be taken within 3 days of the beginning of what we call the Korean War. I guess you can call it the Fatherland Liberation War if you like. Weirdo. The rest of us are going to call it the Korean War. And that's going to take place from 1950, technically, until today. There is an armistice in 1953. I'm going to look here because I think the time is 4 in the morning. Did I write that down right? Yeah, June 25, 1950, 4 in the morning. The North Koreans pour down into South Korea. And the world freaks out a little bit. It's starting to feel a little bit like World War III up in here. There's a concern about escalation. And this brand new United Nations, which was brought into existence as a way of preventing future wars, of preventing a World War III, of preventing the atrocities seen in World War I and II. Remember, the League of Nations was also an attempt to build this Wilsonian dream of sovereignty and equality of nations. This is the first big challenge the UN's going to have to decide. All right, we have a war of aggression. We have the North invading the South. What are we going to do? Well, it's kind of interesting. It's a kind of interesting little question of what if in history, because the UN General Assembly is going to actually take a vote on what to do. Should the UN oppose with force? Think about this. With force, the UN using offensive weaponry to enforce the borders of 2 quasi-nation states. You think about that today, the UN's kind of a joke, right? They're peacekeepers on the Lebanese border, just stood there during times of conflict. We think of peacekeepers in Rwanda not intervening to help. The UN forces actually doing something in this period is possible. But as the UN goes, the United Nations has the Security Council of the 5 big powers. The Soviet Union is one of them. At this point, China is not, because the Republic of China, Taiwan, is actually on the Security Council. Though I don't know if it's actually been officially added to the Security Council in 1950. Someone in the comments can tell me for sure. But the point is that even today, if the UN takes up a resolution, the 5 members of the Security Council have to be unanimous, as in no one can vote against it, for the resolution to pass. So really, the UN is voting to use force to stop the invasion of South Korea. The Soviets could have voted against that and prevented UN intervention in Korea. However, Joseph Stalin tells his people at the UN to abstain. Don't participate in the vote. Basically protest against it. And what this means is that the resolution without a Soviet objection passes. And so for the duration of the Korean War, you're going to have both American troops and UN soldiers fighting to liberate South Korea from North Korea. Now, General MacArthur, hold on one second, is going to help liberate Seoul from the North Koreans. He's going to produce a counteroffensive that is actually going to go all the way into Pyongyang, North Korea. Now, this is why, to this very day, there is a fear in both Seoul and in Pyongyang, about what if one of the, what if the North invades the South and occupies Seoul again, or vice versa? What if the South invades the North and occupies Pyongyang again? It's because of the propaganda and the violence that goes on in this period, the destruction that goes on in this period. The Americans are eventually going to drop so many firebombs on North Korea that they're going to destroy the entirety of North Koreans' industry. They're going to destroy 90 to 95% of most of their major cities. They're basically going to send North Korea back to the Stone Age with their firebombs. They're going to do more destruction in Korea than the firebombs did in places like Japan and Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. And I need to cite my sources here because this is not an original thought from me. Okay, I got it. I'm down on my computer Googling it. It is Samuel F. Wells Jr. of the Wilson Center, who wrote a book about the decision to go to war in Korea and the war in Korea. So anyway, you have this massive destruction. You have the Southern forces and the American and the UN forces actually making their way up past the 38th parallel and into North Korea, occupying places. And this is when Mao Zedong is going to realize that he has to intervene in Korea, despite the fact that Kim Il-sung made that promise that, hey, just sign off on this. Stalin's approved it. Go ahead. I'd love to have your help, but I don't need it. Like, I don't actually need it. You'll never do anything, Mao. Just go ahead and sign off on it. Well, now Mao has got American and UN troops approaching the Chinese border, and Mao doesn't want to have an American, what he would perceive as like an American imperialist puppet, a Republic of Korea, a liberal democracy, or, an American dictator puppet state right along his border. He would actually prefer it if the North Koreans unified Korea, and that if there was at very least a North Korean state on his border, a little bit of a buffer. And so millions and millions of Chinese soldiers flood over the Korean border. This is all still in 1950. So all of the major events of the Korean War are going to take place basically in the first year. So that first push of North Korea into Seoul, that occupation, the repelling by American and UN forces that intervene, and South Korean forces obviously that then pass into North Korea and start occupying places like Pyongyang. And then the Chinese are going to flood in and basically push the American and UN and South Korean forces back across the 38th parallel, and are going to temporarily occupy Seoul again before then being rejected, and we get this stalemate along the 38th parallel. So we basically stop where we started, and there's basically the border that had been created after World War II is now the border that we have in the stalemate of the Korean War. It is the stalemate that eventually becomes part of the armistice in summer of 1953. And this is where we basically have a tacit recognition. Besides the declarations in 1948, in August and September of South Korea and the DPRK, the end of the Korean War, the armistice in 1953, is basically the moment when it is realized that, okay, North and South Korea are not just these temporary occupation zones after World War II. The dream of unifying Korea is not going to happen anytime soon, at least. It's at least going to have to wait. This is when Kim Il-sung is going to not just be the tippy-top dog of North Korea, but after the armistice and after a recognition that really there's not a whole lot to be done regarding the South, Kim Il-sung is going to turn his attention inward, and we are going to see the construction of a personality cult, which I've already alluded to is something that is going to make even the Soviet Union and China feel a little uncomfortable. So let's talk a little bit about Kim Il-sung in North Korea consolidating his power. So let's fast forward to 1955, 1956. Kim Il-sung has not been successful in the Korean War. We've had an armistice and the war basically ended where it started, but he is the top dog. He is the number one. He is the chairman of the party. He is the premier of the state. And he starts to purge people, because even though he is the top of these institutions, he doesn't have a unanimous group of supporters in the Korean Workers' Party. There are two other factions within the Korean Workers' Party that theoretically are a check on Kim Il-sung. One of them is the Soviet faction, that is the faction that is most aligned with the Soviet Union. The other is called the Yan'an faction. We can just shorthand that as the China faction, but let me go ahead and write down Yan'an. If you remember from our last video, we had the Yan'an rectification campaign or rectification movement. This was basically Mao's way of building power between 1941 and 1945 within the Communist Party of China in their little holdout during the war against Japanese imperialism, in which Chairman Mao became not just the undisputed leader, or sorry, not just a leader among communists, but the undisputed leader among communists. And so people who would like to see a more Chinese or Maoist influence in North Korea are known as the Yan'an faction. So we have the Soviet faction, we have the Yan'an faction, and then we have basically the rest, which are the Kim Il-sung-ites. That's a term I'm making up. That's not an official academic term. Now, under the guise of the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, we have some purges because Kim Il-sung is already looking to consolidate his power, and he's looking to eliminate rivals because, you know, if the war ends, he wants to be the undisputed champion, so to speak. We referenced earlier the man named Pak Hon-young. Pak Hon-young. Remember, he was the founder of the North Korean Communist Party in 1945. The Korean Communist Party was outlawed, obviously, by the Japanese imperialists in the 1920s. Then they, they bring it back basically in August 1945. Pak Hon-young does it a little bit too late to become the premier leader in North Korea, but he remains an influential person within North Korea and within the Korean Workers' Party. Kim Il-sung puts this man in a very public trial in 1955. It's a show trial. Now, Pak Hon-young's show trial is unique. You have some show trials in the Soviet Union for some of these higher people who are purged. They come out and talk about their crimes against the party. It's kind of a way of scaring others. In China under Mao, when you have these purges, like in Yan'an, in the Yan'an rectification movement, you have these they're not so much trials as they are like public displays of violence. You have all these people decrying each other out in public. You have the masses mobilized against the top. Later in his life, later in his leadership, Kim Il-sung is going to stop with the show trials because he's going to find that actually just disappearing people and sentencing them to a life in the gulag is going, without any explanation, is going to be a lot scarier than actually having a public trial where people say exactly what they did wrong. If somebody just disappears, that's a lot scarier because you don't even know what they did wrong to get disappeared. But in the trial of Pak Hon-young, this very prominent purge is going to take place from 1953 to about 1955. There's going to be other people along with Pak Hon-young. He's just the most prominent that are purged in this period. And they're going to be basically accused of being traitors and conspiring with the USA during the War of the Liberation of the Fatherland, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. Well, the people who don't particularly care for Kim Il-sung in this period are going to start to worry about this unitary control that he's establishing over the party. And there's a couple reasons this is going to happen. One is just because it's going pretty darn far. And so there's a fear from the Yan'an and the Soviet factions that he's going to purge them next. That's legit. There's also going to be a change within the Soviet Union at this period. Joseph Stalin built a personality cult, but Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. In fact, Joseph Stalin's going to advocate against the end of the Korean War until his death. And a new man is going to take power in the Soviet Union by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev. I believe I've spelled that right. I've written Khrushchev's name 100 million times in my life in undergrad and graduate school. And as part of my educational mission on YouTube, I still have to think every single time I write his name out. And actually, just now I lucked out because my book on Khrushchev was on the shelf right in front of me. So I was able to confirm, indeed, Khrushchev's name is spelled like this. And actually, this book by William Taubman is what, in the historical world, they call a tour de force, a magnum opus, a obra de vida in Spanish, right? This is a masterful book in which he goes through Khrushchev's autobiography. And Khrushchev is prone to exaggerate in his autobiography, so there's a lot of fact-checking that goes on. This is a great book, and it's part of how I've been able to triangulate some of Kim Il-sung's relationship to China and to the Soviet Union in this period, because you know, if you just read books and sources on North Korea, actually you miss out on some of the Soviet perspective. Okay, Nikita Khrushchev, here he is. He is, so again, we're going to be talking about figures who are relatively liberal compared to their predecessor. We talked, in my last video, we talked about how, you know, Deng Xiaoping was relatively liberal compared to Mao Zedong, because basically everyone looks liberal next to Mao Zedong, except for Kim Il-sung probably. Khrushchev is liberal compared to Joseph Stalin in his way of running the Soviet Union. So he creeps his way into becoming the paramount leader in the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin through a phase of different confrontations with people like Levat Beria, who was the butcher of Moscow for Joseph Stalin during the purges. Kogan, like there's a bunch of people that basically Khrushchev elbows out, but it's not to build a personality cult for himself. So when Khrushchev comes to become the paramount leader of the Soviet Union, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because he actually disavows the Stalin cult of personality that had been prevalent in the Soviet Union up until the death of Joseph Stalin. That's how you get the famous anecdotes from Stalin's death where nobody goes in to check on him because they don't want to get purged. Nobody knows what to do when he's dead. They don't want to touch the corpse. They don't know who to call. They don't know who to inform. You've seen the film maybe. There's some historical inaccuracies there, but the point, the general thrust stands that like people were scared to death of Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev gives a secret speech in 1956 after he's accumulated power in which he says that the cult of personality was a mistake, is bad. And he's going to advocate that other communist countries also rid themselves of their cult of personalities. Now, when he says this, he's mostly talking to China, where Chairman Mao is building what is going to be one of the, in terms of loss of life, one of the most consequential cults of personality in human history. The Great Leap Forward is going to kill tens of millions of people. I think 45 is the number, but his cult of personality, even as Khrushchev is talking in 1956, before the Great Leap Forward, has already contributed to like 1 million deaths out during land reform. There's an anti-rightist campaign in China after a 100 Flowers campaign where people are encouraged to bring out their dissent, bring out their criticism, and then they're cracked down on in the anti-rightist campaign. So Khrushchev is criticizing the cult of personality. He's looking mostly to Mao, but he's also advising Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans to avoid cults of personality around one singular leader. You know who doesn't like this message? Two people. the people you most expect. Chairman Mao Zedong in China hates this message. And it's not, well, what's crazy to me about this whole story is that Khrushchev actually thought that Mao Zedong was treated disrespectfully by Stalin. So when Mao, I know this is going to sound like a tangent, but trust me, it's relevant. Mao goes in 1949, 1950, he visits Moscow to try to get Soviet support and to, rework some treaties from the nationalist era and just, get some Soviet recognition for this thing he just did, winning the Civil War in China. And Stalin basically plays psychological games with him, makes him sit around in a dacha and wait, sends all these people to psychoanalyze Mao and see like what kind of a man is he, and basically establish dominance, okay? How else would you establish dominance except for a hand gesture like this? Weirdly enough, Khrushchev sees this and he's like, if I ever get to power, I'm going to be a little bit more like teamwork makes the dream work with Chairman Mao. Mao actually reacts to this very negatively, and this is going to be the beginning of the Sino-Soviet split where like Chinese and Soviet relations are going to basically crash out. And it's ostensibly there's policy issues that surround it, but a lot of it's personality too. Like Mao just didn't respect Khrushchev. Even though Khrushchev was like, I want to respect you more than Stalin did, I guess Mao just liked that disciplinarian daddy Stalin. And in any event, the other person who Khrushchev wants to influence in like a positive way is Kim Il-sung. And again, he's making these overt intimations that places like China and North Korea should get rid of their cult of personalities, right? That there should be, the party's going to have the ultimate control. There's no one in the communist parties of either of these powers, either three of these big powers, is going to ever say, oh, maybe we should like share power with other parties or something. No, it's about what is the structure within the party? Is there a one-man cult of personality like there is with Stalin, like there is with Mao? Kim Il-sung is building his, and this message arrives at basically the worst possible time for Kim Il-sung. Hey, we shouldn't have cults of personalities. And there is something called the August 1956. You see my notes here. I got 1955 Juche. We're going to get to that. Where did I write down the name of this incident? So you get something called the sorry, I had a brain fart. I had to make a cut. You get to the 1956, August 1956 faction incident. Okay. August 1956. August 1956. The Yan'an and the Soviet factions speak up during a meeting of the the Korean Workers' Party. They speak up against the cult of personality. Now, Kim Il-sung had already gotten wind that this was going to take place, this criticism was going to take place. And he's conspired basically to have his people, first of all, denounce the Yan'an and the Soviet factions within this meeting in which the cult of personality is decried, but also he's going to have them purged. And this is the closest Kim Il-sung comes to losing power, actually, because he purges these two people, or not these two people, he purges this whole array of people from these two factions that theoretically they want to reduce Kim Il-sung's power. They don't want to, like, you know, purge him necessarily, remove him from power. They just want him to not appoint himself to the head of everything and to have a bit of more of a collaborative effort within the party. I haven't read the debates or what they said exactly, so don't take my word as gospel there. But basically, Kim Il-sung treats them as an existential threat. He feels that existential threat, and he's kind of right to feel that existential threat because representatives are sent from both China and the Soviet Union. They go to Pyongyang together to tell Kim Il-sung, knock it off, reinstate these two groups into the Korean Workers' Party, the Yan'an faction and the Soviet faction. Now, you can understand why the Soviet Union was doing it a little more obvious. They don't want their influence reduced, and also they are in a moment when they're reducing the cult of personality anyway. China's a little bit more interesting because they have their faction, and they want the group that they influence the most to not be purged, right? But they have their cult of personality, and they're taking umbrage with the fact that the Soviet Union is reducing theirs. So in theory, they should be like, oh, Kim Il-sung's building a cult of personality, great. But even China's like, you know, we'd love to keep our influence. And even though this is a moment of tense relations between the Chinese and the Soviets, they send a joint group to Pyongyang to tell Kim Il-sung to reinstate these people. And he does. He bends. He reinstates them into the party. But Kim Il-sung isn't stupid, and he sees that China and the Soviet Union aren't getting along that well. He realizes that their attention's going to drift, and he's going to purge these people again. 1958, 1959. He's going to be the undisputed tippy-top leader. He's going to purge all of his opposition by 1959. I mean, he's already the undisputed leader. Let's just be clear. But by 1959, he's going to be the double undisputed leader. He's going to be untouchable Kim Il-sung. This is when the 1960s is when North Korea's cult of personality is going to hit insane levels. And I've already referenced it before with the fact that people would visit from other communist countries with cults of personalities and be like, whoa, this pretty crazy here. I've already mentioned that, 1984 is probably the best fictional representation of what, Korea might have looked like at this time with all the Big Brother style Kim Il-sung portraits everywhere. It's going to get really insane. So let's talk about it a little bit, but let's also not forget that North Korea in this period is in better shape than South Korea. Its economy is doing better. Its leadership is looking more stable. In fact, the 1960s are going to basically be the peak of North Korea, the zenith of Kim Il-sung's power, and the zenith for North Korea as a whole in terms of its economy. It's not going to have a Great Leap Forward style famine that China had between 1959, 1960, 1961. There's really what they call the 3 years of difficulty or something in China, right? Kim Il-sung is going to have some Great Leap Forward kind of reforms, but there's not going to be like a big catastrophe. The economy is not going to fall apart. The South is going to look like the economic backwater in the 60s. The South is going to look like the crazy military dictatorship. North Korea, by comparison with the South, is actually going to look better off. Okay? The brand of North Korea is going to look better despite how crazy it's going. And so we're going to talk about that right now. I'm going to make a pause so I can clear the board, wipe my brow, and I'll be right back. Actually, I just got the board clean, and I wrote a couple of things down in the 60s. I realized I need to take a quick step back, which is not going to be a long step back, but basically, so I just wanted to touch on a concept that is going to go on crack in the 60s. It's technically invented in a speech in 1955 called Juche. And Juche, or Juche, can't recall what the exact correct pronunciation is going to basically be Korean socialism. Now, there's a lot to say here because I have referenced already multiple times in this presentation that Kim Il-sung doesn't really care that much about Marxist-Leninism. He doesn't care that much about communism, really. And so it's a little weird to start talking about this Korean socialism that is invented basically in 1955. Kim Il-sung has one of his close associates start to write a Marxist-Leninist justification for his cult of personality that is beginning to merge in the mid-1950s. And I have read about Juche a million times in my life, literally a million. No exaggeration, 1 million. Don't question me. And the thing that drove me nuts for the longest time, the reason I've never really talked about it much in videos is because I always thought I was missing something, that there was some legitimate, development, some additional, like some intellectual addition that Juche was making to Marxist-Leninist thought that I was just missing. In the same way that like Leninism is an addition to Marxism in that you don't need a fully industrialized capital working class to have a revolution, and then Mao, it's like the Maoist thought is its intellectual contribution is about like mass movements from the bottom and peasant revolutions. Juche, I would argue, after all these years of grappling with it, is not an addition intellectually to Marxism-Leninism, and for that reason, it's actually a lot easier to understand. If you just drop the Marxism-Leninism aspect of Juche, it's easier to comprehend. The thing that's going to trip you up is, of course, it's going to be framed as Korean socialism, what Patricia Gause called in her work, Marxism of our style, or socialism of our style, right? And you get a lot of different definitions for it. The very basic translation of Juche, what it means in the speech in 1955 is that North Korea should be self-reliant. So Juche, as a political philosophy, as a governing philosophy, basically translates to self-reliance. You can think about what's happening in this period. We were just talking about the fact that the Soviet Union is transitioning away from its cult of personality, and that China is starting to become a little bit hostile to North Korea, or at the very least, there's this perception that the Yan'an faction is becoming a little bit too meddling in North Korean affairs by Kim Il-sung, and he wants to create the perception that North Korea can survive on its own. Now, there's an irony here, a deep irony, because actually, even in this period when Juche, the self-reliance philosophy, is being promulgated, the North Korea is actually getting a lot of aid from the Soviet Union and China. That never really stops until the end of the Cold War, until the Soviet Union literally collapses. It's going to continue to get aid in some way, shape, or form. North Korea is going to continue to triangulate between Beijing and Moscow until the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about that triangulation in the modern day when we get to Kim Jong Un. But in the meantime, what I want to just tell you is that when Kim Il-sung announces in 1955 that he has a self-reliance philosophy, it's already quite ironic. Nonetheless, the idea is that through hard work, through dedication to Kim Il-sung, through dedication really to extreme nationalism, that North Korea can stand as an autarky, that is to say, a nation state that can exist without help from anyone else. And that's why I mentioned how ironic it is. There are, you know, righteous, moral thoughts to this. Leaders should be subject to no one. I've got some notes down because I've gone through all of my sources, and everyone defines Juche a little bit differently. It's one of those interesting things where you don't find the same definition over and over again. And there's this one line that comes out of it that, if for no other reason, is the most convincing reason why Kim Il-sung is not actually a Marxist-Leninist, and that is the line that Juche basically translates to the man, or Juche represents the idea that man is the master of all things. Man is the master of all things. Let me write that down because that's something that's going to permeate North Korean society to this day. It is sort of the one, like what's the master? Man equals master. It's like the slogan almost of North Korean socialism. So let's talk about why it's a bit of a rejection of Marxism itself by even saying something like this. Man is the master of all things. And then let's talk about how even this manipulated definition ends up getting manipulated even more for Kim Il-sung's purposes of consolidating power. So man is the master of all things is ironic to come from someone who's nominally a communist, because there is a philosophical tradition within Marxism-Leninism. Marx was a historical materialist. Now, if I go too deep into it, I will embarrass myself, so I will just stay on the surface level of these things. But Marxian was responding to Hegel, and if you think about Hegel, his most famous work is Phenomenology of Spirit, and the German philosophy, which Marx and Engels would write in the 19th century, was an opposite of some of the, let's call it, and I don't mean this philosophically, but some of the more esoteric ideals that Hegel would present. And the idea so let's get out of philosophy, because that's where I start to fall apart. And you can already tell probably that I sound a little ignorant. I did not study philosophy as a PhD. I studied politics. And where Marxism-Leninism has something to say about political philosophy and the act of governance is in the fact that history, according to them, should be recognized as a function of material reality. So the idea is that when the material conditions for socialism are ready, there will be a revolution. So it's like a scientific, it's often the word you'll see in quotes, scientific cause and effect system of history in which we can basically take all of the different, and this is conflating some terms here, but basically take all of the different variables of society, the material variables of what life is like for the proletarian, where society is in terms of industrialization, how far along it is from proto-communismus to feudalism to industrialization and capitalism. And we can basically put all those things together and make predictions based on material things that we see to understand where a society is heading and what the next stage they might arrive is. Okay, now let's look at this term from North Korea. Man is the master. This is effectively a vision board way of running a government. It's to say that if you don't think it's possible, I'm Kim Il-sung and I say dreams can be made real. If you think you want a Ferrari, put it on your vision board. It will happen, right? Kim Il-sung is effectively becoming like the Tony Robbins of North Korea, or what's more, Gary Vee, right? Like, I built 15 businesses telling people how to start businesses, so you should listen to me. And if you doubt me, then you're a hater, right? You don't have enough willpower to make your dreams become real, right? Man is the master is basically a way of saying, if you can think it, if you can work hard enough, if you can hustle and wake up at 4 a.m. and praise Kim Il-sung, we can build a socialist utopia. Okay, this is 1950s hustle culture in a communist country. That's what Juche is. Okay, and my humble, non-expert opinion. Now, the reason this is even more crazy is because this man is the master concept, this Juche concept, this idea of self-reliance, basically all gets bastardized into not that man is the master, but Kim Il-sung is the master. Kim Il-sung is the master of all things. Okay, there is, if Kim Il-sung says and thinks it can be done, who are we to question it? Okay, and in fact, over time, this becomes a serious crime to question, to doubt. In fact, there is something called the 10 principles that we're going to get to in a little bit. But now's a good moment for us to move on to the 1960s. The Juche philosophy is basically a way of justifying the creation of the cult of personality. And it's going to be built up over the course of the 60s, but it's going to be crescendoed in 1967 when something called the singular thought system is revealed by Kim Il-sung. Sometimes I see this translated as monolithic ideological system, as opposed to singular thought system. Whatever, you can translate it however you want. That's okay. It's not that complicated, actually. The singular thought system is not that there is a singular thought, as in like one idea in the brain. It is that the singular thought is Kim Il-sung's thoughts, plural. Whatever Kim Il-sung wants goes. So when we talked about the two whatevers in Hua Guofeng after the death of Mao, that was the chosen successor of Mao Zedong in China after he died in 1976. Hua Guofeng promulgated this idea of the two whatevers. Whatever Chairman Mao said, whatever Chairman Mao directed, or something like this. Like, we'll just do whatever Chairman Mao wants, right? The singular thought system is basically that. Whatever Kim Il-sung says, whatever Kim Il-sung wants, that's what we're going to try to do. And not only are we going to try to do it, but we are required to believe that if he thought it, it must be possible, because he is the vision board master. He is the hustle bro of the communist world. He knows what's best. And again, North Korea's ascendant in this period over South Korea. It's looking like the better of the two Koreas. So why not? Why not actually export Juche around the world? And there's going to be an opinion in North Korea actually over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, where it's going to become very much more difficult to make these arguments, but it's going to go around saying that we are the vanguard of the global revolution. Like, we are independent of the Soviet Union and China. We are our own country. It's not true. They're getting aid the whole time. They're also trading with the West. Okay, we'll come back to that. But they're making the argument like we are the self-reliant. Juche is this Marxist-Leninist tradition that we have mastered now. We've added Juche on, Kim Il-sung thought onto Marxist-Leninism, and now like places like the global South, Latin America, African countries, these places that are developing and now are trying to build their own communist revolutions should look to us, North Korea, and should look to Juche and the wonderful thoughts of Kim Il-sung. And in some of the propaganda films from like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you'll see lots of lots of world leaders from the global South coming to Pyongyang. And you'll see like all this footage of Kim Il-sung smiling with leaders from all over the world, and the narrator will say something like, and Kim Il-sung, infused the Juche ideology into this person who thought it was brilliant, and they'll cut to them smiling or something. However, this idea of self-reliance is a terrible myth that North Korea perpetuated on itself, and it's going to have dire consequences actually in the 1990s that we're going to get to. But in 1961, actually, there's going to be an undermining of Juche if you weren't completely, defended from free information by the North Korean regime. You would have heard that there would be a mutual assistance pact between both North Korea and China, and then Soviet Union and North Korea. And so actually, in this period of time, North Korea is beginning to get assistance from both the Soviet Union and China to triangulate as their relations, that is the Soviet and the Chinese relations, break down. North Korea and Kim Il-sung are pretty smartly taking advantage of this to get help. So they get help in terms of like nuclear technology from the Soviets. There's an exchange of scientists. There's I think a light water nuclear reactor or something that's like established, like ground is broken on it, so to speak. And the Soviets have something to do with that. China is, importing and helping with arms. And in fact, it's not until 1958 that Chinese troops actually leave Korea after the Korean War. That's how long, this is going on. Even 3 years after Juche is created, they're getting this help. But it's going to go on steroids in the 1960s, not just because Kim Il-sung is triangulating between the Soviet Union and China, but also because Kim Il-sung is very smartly going to start, well, smartly is probably not the right way to put this because it's going to backfire, but he's going to start to allow Western liberal democracies to basically fund him. You might ask, why would these liberal democracies send money to North Korea? And the answer is, I guess it is a function of like wanting to have influence. And so they would sign, debts to North Korea. And the problem is that by the end of the 60s, this trade and these debts that are being taken on by North Korea, it's becoming very obvious that Korea was taking that money in bad faith and it's never going to pay back that money. And so a lot of those loans and things are going to dry up. It's going to backfire on North Korea in the 70s. But in the 60s, when that money is flowing in, when Western money is flowing in, when Soviet aid is flowing in, when Chinese aid is flowing in, North Korea is looking pretty good in terms of quality of life for its citizens, in terms of industrialization. They've rebuilt from the, remember, they were basically flattened in the Korean War. The American firebombs basically destroyed 90% of cities like Pyongyang, and certainly the industrial parts were gone. Well, in the 60s, all that's rebuilt, all this assistance is coming in. And if you're a random North Korean citizen who's only getting information via like newspapers or radio or whatever, you might be told in the 1960s, hey, we've achieved Juche, we've achieved self-reliance. And you might look around and say, yeah, maybe. And if you're not like particularly well informed and you're living in South Korea and you're not aware of all these subtleties, which why would most people be aware of such things? It might be tempting to think like, hey, this Juche self-reliance Korean socialism from Kim Il-sung in the North, it seems like it's going pretty well. So in 1967, basically at the peak of North Korea, you get the singular thought system. And this is basically, I keep having to say like we're now getting into the cult of personality of Kim Il-sung. It's gradually going up and up and up. And honestly, it's going to go up until about the 80s. And then oh gosh, it's kind of hard to say when it hits its peak, but let's just say that if you want to find the place where the portraits start appearing in homes, in every single home, by law, they must be there. When you want to start talking about the rewriting of history to make Kim Il-sung look like basically a god, it's 1967. This is when you get the singular thought system, when you get the monolithic ideological system. This is the moment. This is when the period that I talked about, the myth-making period, 1930 to 1945, when Kim Il-sung was fighting first with the Communist Party of China, and then he became part of the Red Army in the Soviet Union. That's all scratched. And they say, no. Kim Il-sung was always an independent leader of a Korean nationalist army, basically, a Korean liberation army. Let me see if I can find the official name here. I can't, so let's just keep going. It doesn't matter what the official name is. The Korean Revolutionary Resistance of the Japanese. They basically make it seem like he himself and him, Kim Il-sung, all alone by his lonesome, no Soviets, no Chinese, drove the Japanese imperialists out and formed North Korea, then, resisted the American imperialists in the War of the Fatherland Liberation, yada, yada, yada. He is infallible, Kim Il-sung. That all basically begins on steroids in 1967. The 60s are also when references to those who might have previously been acknowledged as helpers of North Korea are erased from the historical records. So Stalin Street in Pyongyang is renamed to Victory Street. And this is crazy. It becomes a crime for someone to have works of Marx and Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin. The only thought is the singular thought system, which means that basically all books in the country, all media, all opera, all radio. It all becomes Kim Il-sung thought, right? So even though, portraits of Marx and Engels or Marx and Stalin or Mao, like anyone who might have been recognized as being a predecessor of Kim Il-sung and building up the conditions by which Kim Il-sung took power, they're erased from North Korean history. So people in school, they have Kim Il-sung research centers, and it's basically a classroom in every school where you go to study the thoughts of Kim Il-sung. You're taught from an early age about him riding around on a horse and liberating and fighting the Japanese. And his thoughts are the only thoughts that matters. Marxism-Leninism disappears. So it's another argument to say that Kim Il-sung was not a true believer like these others were. This is also a period when North Korea, because its ascendant, starts to think, hey, maybe we can retake the South. Maybe we can have a second Korean War or a second Fatherland Liberation War and basically remove the South Koreans who were doing, again, like I said, pretty poorly in this period. And you have something called the Blue House Raid in 1968. The president, or the dictator, Chong-Il of South Korea, his residence is assaulted. He's almost killed. You have the 68 basically kidnapping of 82 crew members from the USS Pueblo. Admittedly, it was a spying operation off the coast of North Korea, but these 82 crew are held for 11 months in 68. And in 69, you have a spy plane shot down. So the point I'm trying to make here is that North Korea is ascendant in the 60s, and they don't realize that they're at their peak at this moment, and they're beginning to act irresponsibly. And this is actually over time going to damage their relations with the Soviet Union and with China, because they're going to appear to be pretty reckless. Because in the 70s, they're going to basically become a pariah state. And this is when the North Korea that we understand today begins to emerge, because a couple things happen. One is that their economic prosperity begins to falter. The money from the West starts to dwindle, and the Chinese and the Soviets start to distance themselves from the North Koreans, because the North Koreans start to do like literal terrorism in the 70s. So, and 80s. You don't just have the cult of personality and the North Korean stuff. You have like crime involvement from the North Koreans, involved in smuggling and drugs and like things that are actually damaging to the international economy, even to like their allies, look particularly strange. And you have the development of the North Korean nuclear weapons program, which Kim Il-sung, as early as the Korean War, realizes there's this controversy that General MacArthur, when he's pushed back out of the North by the Chinese forces, that he wants to, the history is a little disputed, but basically he advises President Truman to consider tactical nuclear weapons in North Korea to retake some of the lost territory. And Truman dismisses him for this. It makes Truman increasingly unpopular. It's part of the reason why Truman doesn't seek a second elected term as president of the United States, because General MacArthur is generally considered popular at this time, and his ejection by Truman is unpopular. Anyway, when the rumors come in the North that like the Americans might use nukes like they used in Japan, people freak the hell out. They start fleeing. And the North Koreans at this time don't have like a super strong totalitarian state to stop people from moving around. Freedom of movement still exists in North Korea. And so people are basically allowed to go, either fleeing to China or fleeing to the South to avoid these nuclear weapons. And Kim Il-sung sees the psychological effect of nuclear weapons at this time, and he decides, I want some of those for myself. So I mentioned that they got some aid in terms of nuclear power from the Soviets in like the early 60s, but basically neither the Chinese nor the Soviets want Kim Il-sung and North Korea becoming a nuclear power. And this starts to introduce tension in the 60s and 70s when it becomes clear that North Korea is going to be pursuing a nuclear weapons program. There's also the fact that in the 1970s, President Carter, when his term begins in 1970, he's elected in 1976, he starts removing American soldiers from South Korea and removing American nukes. There were lots of American nukes in South Korea at the time. He starts pulling those out as a way of demilitarizing the Korean Peninsula. And yet in 1974, it's discovered that there are tunnels built by the North Koreans, dug by the North Koreans into South Korea via the DMV. And so there is this fear that's starting to emerge that North Korea hasn't forgotten that it wants to take South Korea, and that it's doing all these other strange illegal things. It's building a nuclear weapons program. It's not paying back its foreign debt, so he's been cut off financially. It's starting to act more and more radically, and it's created this totalitarian cult of personality that is basically unrivaled in world history. And all of that boils together to say North Korea, the modern North Korea, the one that we think of today, the crazy pariah state that starts to have a faltering economy that's devastating to its people, that cracks down when things are bad to make sure that the Kim regime stays in place. This is the North Korea that it starts to emerge in the 1970s. Meanwhile, South Korea at this moment, even though they're losing some of the support of the United States, are starting to have an economic turnaround. They're not going to democratize until the 80s, in the late 80s, in fact, but they're going to start to look like the more prosperous of the two Koreas. And this is going to play out into the 1980s. In the 1980s, first of all, North Korea is going to go full blast on the terrorism. So they're going to bomb, I believe, in 1983, they try to kill the South Korean president in Burma, which we call Myanmar today. In 1987, they hire a terrorist group from Palestine to blow up planes, a South Korean airliner, in the lead up to the 1988 Seoul Olympics. And the fact that South Korea has been awarded the Olympics is already a point of deep pain for Kim Il-sung, who immediately begins to build like stadiums and things in North Korea as if there's going to be a joint hosting of the Olympics, even though it's been awarded to South Korea. And the North Korean economy really begins to falter in the 80s, while the South Korean economy starts to look incredibly prosperous. The dictator, Chong-Il, is assassinated in the 80s or the late 70s. And even though South Korea doesn't immediately democratize, dissident parties are starting to do better in elections and win seats in the legislature. And by 1987, 1988, South Korea is basically going to democratize fully, just in time for the Seoul Olympics, which is basically, if you want to think of a moment where the two Koreas basically cross lines, that's it. North Korea on the descent and South Korea on the ascent. And if there was any doubt in anyone's mind, once the Seoul Olympics went off without a hitch, without any acts of violence from the North during the Olympics themselves, and once the television screens in everywhere except North Korea were flooded with imagery of a very prosperous South Korea with, this economic miracle that's taken place through things like market liberalization, there's really no doubt that North Korea is isolated. Keep in mind, this is about 10 years into the reform and opening up in China as well. When Deng Xiaoping becomes the paramount leader in China in 1978, 1979, he begins the process of reform and of opening up, of market reforms on the coast, of basically creating capitalist socialism, socialist capital. I don't know what the term would be, but basically allowing little pockets of capitalism within China, allowing individual farmers to leave the collective and try to survive, which, believe it or not, was controversial in China at the time. So China is reforming and opening up. North Korea is not. North Korea is going to be insistent in the 80s that they are not going to follow the Chinese path. They are not going to pay back their debts. They're going to pursue a nuclear program. They're going to do acts of international crime and violence. And they're going to insist on their cult of personality around Kim Il-sung. But there's another figure that starts to emerge in the 1980s. And it's one of the reasons I'm kind of rolling past the 80s really quickly, is because the power in North Korea starts to wane from Kim Il-sung a little bit in the 1980s. He kind of becomes co-leader in this period. Does this mean that North Korea is democratizing, that the cult of personality of the Kim family is disappearing? No, it's because a new Kim is entering the stage in the 1980s. He's the next person we're going to talk about, Kim Jong Il. I'm going to clear the board, and we're going to go on about him just a little bit. So just finished cleaning off the board. In the Soviet Union, the cult of personality around Joseph Stalin started to fall apart basically immediately when he died. 1953. Eventually that leads to Nikita Khrushchev taking power, maneuvering his way to the tippy top, and then giving his secret speech in 1956 decrying the cult of personality. in China, Mao Zedong, as he approached his death in the 1970s, he kind of fails to get a successor picked properly. He ends up going with Hua Guofeng after like 3 or 4 other choices. And if you watch my last video, know that Hua Guofeng basically was the paramount leader of China for a very short period of time. Started to become sidelined by Deng Xiaoping, really almost before he took power, but let's just say 1978. So Hua Guofeng got 2 years as paramount leader of China, barely. And so, we think of these totalitarian cult of personality communist states, but we also think about the things that changed in them after their founders, after their big honcho died. And obviously, for the point of the story, we're discounting Lenin. We're just talking about Stalin and the Soviet Union. But the point remains that there's a lack of a plan of who will take over. Stalin makes basically no plans for his death. Mao makes bad plans for his death and succession. And so there's a scramble after they go. And Kim Il-sung, as the leader of North Korea, watches this and wants to avoid it. And one of the interesting things about Kim Il-sung is when we had his name up on the board, remember he was the paramount leader in North Korea from 1945 until 1994. So from the moment Korea is independent from Japan until the 1990s, that means he was present for Stalin, he was present for Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, right? Yeltsin, after the Soviet Union's gone. He's present for Mao, for Deng Xiaoping, and even for a little bit of Jiang Zemin. And he's around for decades of presidents as well. He's almost like a little bit like the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth or whatever, that just was around for so long. You're like, oh my gosh, this is a pillar. What? You have something to say? Yeah? What else do you think about the cult of personality? Okay, so now we have that perspective as well. You interrupted me so much. Yeah? Sweet girl? Yeah, what else do you think? Yeah? Okay, we're going to continue with Kim Jong Il now. Because that's ultimately what Kim Il-sung chooses to do, is he chooses to pick his successor and groom them in their... Gosh, okay. I'm losing my mind. My cat is very insistent that she needs my attention, but we're going to power through here. And we're going to go a little quicker now. If you've been with me this long, we've established Kim Il-sung. We can get through Kim Jong Il and Kim Jong Un pretty quickly because, like I said, once you understand Kim Il-sung, everyone else is just a reaction to him. So in the 70s, Kim Il-sung chooses his son, Kim Jong Il, to take his place. So Kim Jong Il is going to take Kim Il-sung's place. Now, according to the history books and, in terms of being the tippy-top paramount leader, Kim Jong Il is only going to be doing that from his father's death in 1994 until his own death in 2011. However, Kim Jong Il doesn't just appear like Hua Guofeng does when Mao Zedong dies. Kim Jong Il doesn't just come out of nothing or have to fight his way to the top like Khrushchev. Kim Jong Il is handpicked, we think, somewhere in the 1970s, and is actually formally announced as the successor to Kim Il-sung in 1980. This is weird. Okay, this is, again, Kim Il-sung is not a great communist because hereditary, we could say all sorts of things about communists, but hereditary, like monarch style succession from father to son, that's not a communist thing. Marx never talked about that. Lenin never talked about that. Stalin and Mao never considered such things, right? They at least were choosing like party apparatchiks or whatever, or in this case of Stalin making no plans. Like the idea that you'd install your own son to take over your cult of personality after, that's a hell of an innovation. And again, it's just more evidence that like Kim Il-sung was just interested in power, interested in nationalism, maybe interested in himself and his legacy, but communism, building socialism to eventually fall away and have a utopia. No, this is nuts. it's announced that Kim Jong Il is going to be his father's successor officially for the world on October 10th of 1980. But he's making his way in the scenes. He's usurping some of the other potential heirs of Kim Il-sung, like his uncle and his half-brother, in the 1970s. And one of the ways that it's assumed that Kim Jong-il, because we don't know for sure exactly, we don't have like a paper from Kim Il-sung saying, I chose not my brother, not my first son, I chose Kim Jong-il from my second marriage, I think, to an actress. I chose him because of this reason. We don't really have that. What we do have, however, is evidence that Kim Jong-il made his way up the echelons by helping his father build his cult of personality even bigger than it already was in the 70s and 80s. Kim Jong-il joins the Communist Party officially in 1961. Unlike his father, he doesn't have much international experience, so he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't speak Russian or Chinese. He doesn't study abroad like his son is going to do, Kim Jong-il's son, that is, Kim Jong Un. He doesn't spend time outside of Korea. Instead, he studies at the Kim Il-sung University. And he is hyper-focused, however, even though he never leaves North Korea. He is obsessed with things non-North Korea, particularly cultural things non-North Korea, particularly film, and American films, Hollywood films, and South Korean films. Kim Jong-il is going to begin a collection which I believe reaches something like 20,000 films. He's going to become obsessed with having the embassies around the world of North Korea literally like sending in films from all over the world for him to view. He's going to enjoy South Korean music. He enjoys karaoke. He enjoys the cultural things that come from outside North Korea. And what this instills in Kim Jong-il as a young man is that the way to people's hearts, the way to change politics, is not necessarily only through top-down leadership, a singular thought system, though he does believe in those things, but is through the power of propaganda. And so in 1967, he becomes head of, what do you know, the propaganda department in North Korea. I have two different names for it. One is propaganda and agitation department, which I think is an awesome name for a government bureaucracy. Go agitate. I mean, I know what they're saying in communist parlance, but it's still kind of a funny concept. The head of state propaganda and info. Okay. So Kim Jong-il starts to make these films that that lionize his father and build the cult of personality even bigger. And I said earlier that he had a film called The Flower Girl, where all these things are going bad. And then Kim Jong-il rides in and liberates the girl and her flowers or whatever. One of his most famous works on his IMDb page, still can't believe I'm saying that, about a communist leader, Sea of Blood, which is, I believe, about the Japanese resistance, though it could have been about the Korean War. And the reason I'm staring at my notes so much is because I have a couple names that I can't memorize, and it's a couple people that Kim Jong-il kidnaps from South Korea to make films in North Korea, to help him make films. There's a whole book about it. I believe it's called Kim Jong-il Productions. You can read it. It's an interesting book. I haven't read it cover to cover, but the story is of a South Korean film director named Jin-Sung and Choi Un-hee. And Choi Un-hee is the wife of Jin-Sung. They have interesting biographies of how they came to make films together as this power couple in the South Korean film industry, but they are dragged from 1978 to 1986. They are in North Korea as basically prisoners of Kim Jong-il and help him make propaganda films that lionize his father, Kim Il-sung. The two eventually escape. It's absolutely insane, and we actually get a voice recording of Kim Jong-il describing what they're going to do for him and things. We don't get much of Kim Jong-il. He doesn't give very many. I think he gives one speech at some point when his father is still alive, and then he doesn't speak publicly again. His son, Kim Jong Il's son, Kim Jong Un, is going to give a lot more public speeches. Kim Jong Il, for this reason, because he's not particularly personable and because he's often behind the scenes, behind the camera, literally, he's often written off as sort of this person that was just an awkward leader of North Korea. He wasn't beloved like his father. Probably true. Is not beloved like his son is now becoming in North Korea. Probably also true, but that doesn't mean that he was like stupid or completely disconnected. And part of that narrative also boils down to the fact that Kim Jong Il didn't like to leave Korea. Kim Il-sung, even though he's going to rewrite the history a lot, does spend a considerable amount of time outside of the country. Kim Jong Un is going to spend time outside of the country. He's going to visit Russia a lot, and he just recently visited China. We'll talk about that soon. Kim Jong Un is also going to get a large chunk of his education outside of North Korea in Switzerland. Kim Jong Il, meanwhile, stays in Korea basically the entire time, which means that Western intelligence has even less information about Kim Jong Il when he eventually takes power from his father in 1994, even though by the time he takes the ultimate power, he's already been the announced successor publicly for 14 years. And he's already been on the stage since the 1970s. In fact, he's been on the stage really as an up-and-comer since 1967 when he starts to run the propaganda and agitation department. In the 1970s, he makes this rise. He usurps his uncle. He usurps his half-brother. They're thrown to the side. Kim Il-sung decides, you, my boy, Kim Jong-il, are going to be the man. By the 1980s, when North Korea is doing all this crazy pariah state stuff, bombings, kidnappings, international crime, whatever, like building a nuclear program that's even alarming to the Soviets and the Chinese, not paying back international debt, having an economy that's faltering. This is also a time in which Kim Jong-il is starting to become a parallel leader of North Korea. And there's these accounts from defectors, and the one I believe I'm thinking of right now is Jin-Sung, who in 2014, as a defector, published a book called Dear Leader. Yeah, and we're also going to talk a little bit about Tae Yong-ho, who's a defector, who wrote a book in 2024 called Passcode to the Third Floor. We get a little bit, and we have to be careful. We take everything with a grain of salt because we really don't know for sure. It's only one person's account, or in this case, I'm referencing two accounts, but whatever. When they tell us things about what goes on inside North Korea, of course we want to listen because we don't get too many defector accounts, especially not these days as it's become harder and harder to get away and to escape. But what we learn from these insider accounts, we think, is that during the 1980s, Kim Jong-il is actually starting to run the government more than his father is. His father's getting older. His father celebrates his 70th birthday in 1982, and his health is somewhat on the decline until his death in 1994. So he makes some appearances after that, Kim Il-sung does, but the day-to-day government operations are running on parallel tracks at this time. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that according to some defector accounts in the 1980s and the early 1990s, if you needed a decision made or you needed to give a report, you would give that report first to the office of Kim Jong-il, and then, only then, would you give it to Kim Il-sung. So there is a order of operations that is changing in this period that would lead us to believe that even before he officially takes power in 94, Kim Jong-il is at least partially running the country, even if his father continues to have the final say, which means that when we think about the South Korean airline bombing in 1987, before the Seoul Olympics, when we think about the very strange World Youth Festival that happened in 1989, it's a athletic competition that happened after the Seoul Olympics, but in Pyongyang in North Korea is basically the answer to South Korea emerging on the world stage. We have to imagine that Kim Jong-il had something to do, or a lot to do with that spectacle. And even earlier on, the Burma bombing, these attempted assassinations, we have to assume that Kim Jong-il in the 1980s was already affecting some of these decisions, that it wasn't merely Kim Il-sung doing it. And so we could theoretically like fudge this number here to say that somewhere between 1980 and 1994, Kim Jong-il takes power. His father is definitely still in charge. When Kim Il-sung dies, he's considered the eternal president. And President Eternal. That's Kim Il-sung. right? And in fact, when Kim Il-sung dies in 1984, there's ostensibly 3 years of mourning before Kim Jong-il will officially take any of the titles that his father held. So premier of the party or premier of the government. He never takes the term president. That term is abolished, basically, so that Sung can hold it forever. General secretary, chairman of the party, chairman of the Central Military Commission. These are all going to go to Kim Jong-il after a few years of mourning of the death of Kim Il-sung, which, you know, Western observers at the time, because this is the first transition in North Korea's history, they're not totally sure if they're going to pull it off, right? And so there's a feeling at the beginning that maybe Kim Jong-il is not taking these offices because, well, maybe actually there's, you know, power struggles in the North Korean government, or maybe they're going to, you know, open up and reform like China did under Deng Xiaoping. And, you know, it didn't take long for people to realize, no, that's not what's going on at all. Just fun facts. 1982, real quick, we're going to just a little bit go back to the 80s just for a second. I promise it'll be very quickly. 1982, Kim Jong-il unveils for his father's 70th birthday Juche Tower. Very famous. I'll put a picture up. Very famous tower in Pyongyang, and the effectively the Arc de Triomphe, the victory, the triumph tower, the triumph arc that would theoretically be like celebrating Kim Il-sung's victory over Japan in 1945. We all know that's a fake hagiography, but what's also fake hagiography is Kim Jong-il's birth. Kim Jong-il was actually born in 1941. And he was actually born in the Soviet Union. And he's going to be brought back with his father, presumably in September 1945. And, you know, from then on, he's not going to remember his like literal early days in the Soviet Union. And from then on, he's going to live in Korea. But the history books are actually going to change this. The official history in North Korea is going to say Kim Jong-il was actually born in 1942. And he wasn't born in the Soviet Union. No. He was born on Mount Paektu. Mount Paektu is a very legendary mountain, actually near the border with China, that is going to be the legendary birthplace of Kim Jong-il. And there's going to be all these stories. When he was born, like birds, you know, brought him, and there was thunder cracking, and there were storms, and everyone, all the party revolutionaries put down their arms and celebrated and came to see the savior boy birth. It sounds a lot like Jesus, all right? When Kim Jong-il is born, very silly. And I think his birth name is like Yuri or Yura. So he becomes Kim Jong-il. It would be like Yuri Kim would be his birth name. And I think there's even something very Russian in between that, like Yuri Ivanovich Kim or something. And then over time, you know, obviously it gets way more Koreanized to Kim Jong-il. And that's the man we know today. The reason I wanted to go back to the 1980s, though, was to talk about some of the events that are going on in 1989, 1990, 1991. That is the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. These are things that are going to be extremely difficult. I'm almost done. We just got Kim Jong Un left, Sophie. We can do it. North Korea's economy is already doing bad. It's already becoming a pariah state in the 70s. Its economy is looking awful in the 80s. It's looking like a literal terrorist, like, state, nation state. It is extremely bizarre. There are things going on, like diplomats have to bring back cash and sell illicit things and participate in like actual organized crime where they're stationed in order to fund the foreign office of North Korea to keep embassies open and to feed the lifestyle of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. And then the worst comes to worst, which is that the Soviet Union and this entire system of international communism collapses. And, you know, when East Germany goes, like Erich Honecker, the paramount leader in East Germany, had been a really good friend of Kim Il-sung, and had visited Pyongyang many times. And in fact, when Erich Honecker merged the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party in East Germany into a single party, the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, this is something that would influence Kim Il-sung's merging of the North and South Korean Communist Party in the late 1940s. I think I got that timeline right. If I didn't, somebody can tell me in the comments. Maybe it's reversed. Maybe Kim Il-sung influenced Erich Honecker in East Germany. The point being that losing these allies, even ones that maybe not have been, like, obviously East Germany was a satellite state of the Soviet Union, was part of that bloc. So it's not that essential that these Eastern countries were giving aid and technology to North Korea, though some of that was happening. But losing all your friends all at once kind of sucks. And China in this period, in like the early 90s, this is the period of Jiang Zemin. This is the period when the Tiananmen Square massacre has just occurred. And there is, a desire in China to go inward and to deal with their own internal problems. And China also suffered greatly after the fall of the Soviet Union, even though they, had the Soviet split and everything, and they always pretended to not be BFFs. Nonetheless, like this block goes, and the effects are catastrophic in Korea, and a famine kicks off. And the peak famine years in North Korea are 1995 to, I believe, 1998. This is when something like 600,000 to 1 million people die of famine. Now, there's an open question that's a little hard to answer as to why did the collapse of the Soviet Union mean that 500,000 to 1 million people died in North Korea? Was the Soviet Union sending food into North Korea? Is that what the problem is? And the answer is not really. There's a couple of things. One is that there is a flood. There's a period of flooding in North Korea that perpetuates or exacerbates the food shortage. But there's also a couple of things that are being provided by the Soviets and the Chinese that go away. Now, a lot of the industrial technology in North Korea came from the Soviet Union. Remember, it's the Soviets that help Korea industrialize in the 40s and the 50s. It's the Soviets that fund Kim Il-sung's government to a great extent in this period. And when the Soviet Union collapses, that also means that North Korea's access to Soviet replacement parts for machines goes. So that likely contributed to the economic woes and the lack of ability for the North Korean government to purchase even like food to feed its people after it's clear that the crops are going awry. There's also just the fact that the trade with the Soviet Union accounted for something, I want to say, like 50% of the North Korean economy. And so when that trading partner goes away, that also means that the North Korean economy is just going to do a lot worse. It's going to have less funds to buy food aid to help feed its people. So that's a multifaceted way of saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union had a big impact on the famine. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is not just because it's important, because these are all human lives, but because Kim Jong Il takes power from his father. The famine's already kind of kicked off at this point. 1992, 1993, 1994. North Korea ain't doing so great. And then Kim Jong Il takes power in 1994. And in his first years of power, it must feel like the whole roof is falling down. And that's not to create sympathy or empathy for Kim Jong Il. It's to help explain what happened next. Because Kim Jong Il could have made a decision at this period of looking around and saying, okay, liberal democracy is clearly ascending. Communism is clearly falling apart. It's just us in Cuba now, or whatever. We're all alone. We're isolated. We're doing terrible. Even the Communist Party of China is all about liberal economics, and it's not as the Mao cult of personality is decades back. Maybe we should accept reality and go down this path as well. And what Kim Jong-il does instead is say, no, that sounds like a great way to threaten my monopoly on power. We talked a lot in our last video about China and the Communist Party being scared of losing their monopoly on power. They go through what's called a near-death experience during the Tiananmen Square and nationwide protests. And, part of like even Xi Jinping's governance today is a response to that. there's a perception that no, what actually needs to happen in North Korea is a doubling down on the cult of personality, on the one man rule over the party and over society in general. That the singular thought system, the monolithic ideological system, the cult of personality that really Kim Jong Il has been instrumental in building needs to not only not reform, but it needs to become even more intense. And maybe somewhere deep down, Kim Jong Il is doing a little bit like Xi Jinping did later on, decades later, when he took power and saying Mikhail Gorbachev, in reforming the Soviet Union, began to bring about its downfall. And so Kim Jong Il saying, by reforming, I'm potentially bringing about the downfall of North Korea. And at this point, North Korea is just the Kim regime. So reform means an existential threat to me. So they don't do it. Instead, they go with a policy called military first. I'm just going to write first like this. And the Korean term of military first is Songun. The idea is that whatever else is going on in the country, people are starving, the economy's falling apart, we're having to do international crime in order to just fund my lifestyle and keep the government afloat. We're completely isolated diplomatically. Whatever we do get, it goes to the military first. So there is, and the reason, of course, is because if state power is threatened, who can make sure that it stays in power regardless? It's the military. So you keep your benefactors, the North Korean military, happy. You build your army up to, at this point, it's the 4th largest in the entire planet, the 4th largest standing military. North Korea is not the 4th largest country on the planet. It's quite the achievement, especially in a famine period. This is going to be the raison d'être, the reason for being for the North Korean state for a time, is to keep the military afloat, to keep Kim Jong Il afloat. And there's a purge between 1997 and 2000 in which certain elements that might have been looking to reform during the famine period because of just how bad it got were purged. And this was ostensibly, from Kim Jong-il's point of view, is about making sure that people were held accountable for folks starving. But what it really was Kim Jong-il saying, okay, the worst is behind us now. It's time to get rid of people who piped up during this horrible period. Kim Jong-il has an innovative philosophy to go along with Juche, his father's philosophy. We talked about the 10 principles of the singular thought system, or the 10 principles of the ideological monolith. Kim Jong-il comes up with these rules to help his father, Kim Il-sung, perpetuate the ideological system of Juche. It functions effectively like the 10 Commandments. And just to illustrate how much this doubled down, here's some of the 10 Commandments that have been translated and simplified a little bit for us by Owen Hassig in their 2021 book, North Korea in a Nutshell. 10 principles of the monolithic ideological system. Entire society influenced by Kim Il-sung. Respect, revere, and loyalty to Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, absolute authority. Believe in Kim's ideology. Carry out Kim's instructions. Strengthen party unity around Kim Il-sung. Imitate Kim Il-sung in personality and work style. Repay Kim Il-sung for life he has given you. Establish strong discipline in line with the uniformity of Kim Il-sung thought, and make sure that future generations are given the task of Kim Il-sung's building of Juche. So Kim Jong-il is just like, he's going to take his time in power to double down on everything and to not let up even a little bit. And it looked crazy at the time. Western observers said it's got to be collapsing any day now. I'm sure that even people like in China and in Russia, like they all, there's this presumption, right? The Fukuyama quote that is often misinterpreted, but the end of history, the idea that the end of the Soviet Union was the moment when basically the turn happened, and if the Soviet Union is going to collapse and become a liberal democracy, which, spoiler, it didn't, but then every country eventually is going to do this, right? So the moment will come for North Korea, right? And Kim Il-sung is really standing alone and saying, no, liberal democracy is not coming here to North Korea, and my personal dictatorship will not be touched. This is a period when the gulags are in full force. So one of the most famous things that we think about when we think of North Korea is the political prisons, the Kwanliso and hold on, I'm losing my brain here. The Kwanliso and the Kyowaso. The Kwanliso being the far worse political prisons where people go there to die, to starve to death, to live on 500 grams of corn on a daily ration, to study the works and to be re-educated, even though the re-education is not part of some sort of way of preventing recidivism, because people will never leave. Where torture happens, where the 3 generations of family were punished, where people are disappeared by the Ministry of State Security. These sorts of gulags are still in use during the Kim Jong Il period, though they are going to decline as the situation stabilizes, and the familial punishment, the intergenerational punishments of, not just you being punished, but your children and grandchildren also being raised in these political prison camps. There's even schools built in the political prison camps for political prisoners, for the terrible crime of criticizing the regime or not believing 100% in all 10 principles of the monetary or the monolithic ideological system. These sorts of political crimes are not going to be punished intergenerationally as things start to loosen in the Kim Jong-il late period. But the gulags themselves are going to continue to be there, and they're still there today. There's about 6 of these worst of the worst Kwanliso camps under Kim Jong Un, as far as we know. That continues to be a means of control and the fear of being sent there, a way of making sure that there is no dissent in the ranks. Speaking of which, one of the best ways to determine whether you're going to die in the famine was through your class, your caste system. And this is one of the weirder aspects of North Korean history, is that during the early formation of North Korea and developing until it became a little bit less relevant in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, was the Songbun caste system. Let's see if I can write that thick enough. Songbun. Now, don't mistake this for the Songun military first policy. Songbun is a caste system that put people in North Korea, like literally every citizen in the whole country theoretically had a intelligence file made about them, and they were categorized into 3 places. The enemies of the party class was the very bottom. The wavering class is the majority, or rather the plurality of the country, the middle, and then the tippy top is like the loyal caste. Let me see if I can find the exact names. It's core, wavering, and hostile. So the core is the people who are absolutely loyal. Wavering is the bulk of the country, the plurality, and the hostile is all of the people that are like political enemies or whatever. They're part of the Yan'an faction or the Soviet faction, and they get purged, or anyone who speaks badly ends up being down in these classes. That these sorts of things ended up determining your access to resources when the government distributed everything, your access to education and work, your children's access to education and work. You wouldn't want to marry outside of your class, because then you would be pulled down into the class of your significant other, and your children would be too. And like I said, it becomes less relevant over time, but in the famine, one of the best ways to determine whether you're going to die or not, whether you're going to starve to death or not, is if you were maybe in one of these hostile, heavy regions like in the north. But despite all of the tensing up of the authoritarianism, despite the fact that the cult of personality of Kim Il-sung continues on, and Kim Jong-il basically grafts himself onto it. All the portraits of Kim Il-sung, which it's a crime to let be dusty in your home, are not replaced, but a Kim Jong-il portrait is just put next to them. And when Kim Jong-il is around, he's mostly called the dear leader, where his father was the great leader. His son, Kim Jong-il's son, Kim Jong-un, is going to be called the great successor. But in any event, Kim Jong-il is going to be made the permanent general secretary after he passes. So his father's the eternal president. Kim Jong-il is the eternal general secretary. Who knows what Kim Jong-un will be? They're going to start having to make titles that don't actually take government offices, because then who will take the offices if it's just a bunch of ghosts that occupy them? But whatever. All of this continues, and yet, even though it's only really visible in retrospect, there is maybe, just just a loosening of North Korea's authoritarianism starting in the mid-aughts, so like 2007. What am I talking about? These are the worst moments. This, like, the late 80s, the early 90s are existential crisis moment for communism, right? Soviets gone, Soviet bloc's gone, China's opened up and reformed. And people, hundreds of thousands of million people have died in North Korea, and people anticipate it's going to collapse at any moment. That moment, late 80s, 90s, mid 90s, begins to pass. And as the new millennium approaches, it's not as though things are going great in North Korea, but the military first policy is actually going pretty well. Kim Jong Il plays the powers against each other. He starts to triangulate with the United States and Europe to secure aid in exchange for suspending its nuclear program. And if you read defector accounts, all of this was just a ruse to get aid. And North Korea really never had an intent of slowing down its nuclear program. It was any negotiation with the West, be it a visit from Jimmy Carter in 1994, one of Kim Il-sung's last public appearances, seeing Jimmy Carter and agreeing a framework for denuclearization in exchange for aid, be it the visit from Madeleine Albright in 2000, I believe, again, denuclearization in exchange for aid, be it various agreements with the Bush administration after they're called part of the Axis of Evil in George W. Bush's 2002, I believe, State of the Union address, or one of the speeches he gave after 9/11. Over and over again, North Korea intimates that it's going to stop its nuclear program, but then reneges. And they're going to actually have their first successful nuclear test in 2006. Now, I think this is a significant turning point, not just because it means that there's another nuclear power on the planet, which, in my humble opinion, isn't great when we have lots of nuclear proliferation. It's also a big moment because I think this is a moment when the North Korean regime can at least feel a little bit more secure internationally. There is just a simple reality that having a nuclear weapon is a great way to avoid being invaded. And we, not to make this too presentist, but, like, we've seen that Ukraine has been run over by the Russians. And would history be different right now? Would Russia have invaded Ukraine in 2022 if Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons as part of its departure from the Soviet Union in the 90s? Who knows? There's a reason that both India and Pakistan are insistent on having nuclear weapons, because they see each other as a threat. There's a reason that the People's Republic of China and under Mao Zedong wanted to have nuclear weapons. And there's a reason that Castro in Cuba in the 60s wanted to have Soviet nuclear weapons on his island, because the Americans had tried to invade or had like the Bay of Pigs, false flag operation or whatever, and tried to take Cuba and had been meddling for decades. There's a reason nukes, even though like the fire bombs did more damage in Japan than the nukes did, maybe. I don't want to get relative about suffering here, but you get the point. Like, firebombing in Japan did a lot of damage. Firebombing in the Korean War did a lot of damage. Even if MacArthur had gotten his wish for tactical nukes, the firebombing probably decimated cities more than one nuclear bomb or one tactical nuke used on the battlefield would have done to North Korea. And so in 2006, there's reasons for Kim Jong Il to feel somewhat secure. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I said there might be a little bit of a loosening here, just a little bit. There's a problem that Kim Jong Il identifies in about 2007, which is that during the famine period, there are lots of bribes and there are lots of black markets that start to open for foodstuffs from outside of North Korea. And into the 2000s, there begins to be access to not just food in the black market, but media and things from outside North Korea that the North Korean government would really prefer people not have. Cell phones. And Kim Jong-il actually decries this as a watering down of Juche. However, Kim Jong-il doesn't really have the power to stop it. And we're going to see from 2007 onwards that the North Korean people are basically given permission to exist in a way that they just didn't have prior, right? If you're dying in the famine, you're dying. The state gives you everything, and if it's giving you nothing, you're dying. in the period after 2007, after this famine's passed, after North Korea acquires nuclear weapons, maybe it's out of just the fact that the North Koreans don't have the power to stop it. That is, the supreme leader doesn't have the power to stop it. Or maybe it's because there's just a little bit more of a relaxation and a realization that like North Korea actually could collapse if they don't let people just live. Things like black markets, a little bit of like opening up occurs in North Korea. And there's a sense that the opening up and reform saved the Chinese Communist Party, and that they flirted with fire a little bit by opening up too much too fast. But, you know, in the realm, in the reign of Kim Jong Un, who we're going to talk about next, you're going to see that there is a new philosophy on the block that's going to say that we can have nuclear weapons, we can have state sovereignty, and we can enjoy the prosperity of socialism. So that's what we're going to talk about next when we talk about Kim Jong Un. So while I'm clearing the board, I want to tell you a little bit about Kim Jong Un's early life, because he spends the 1990s when people are starving. 600,000 to 1 million North Koreans are starving. Kim Jong Un is a boy, so I mean, he can't be morally responsible for anything, but it is crazy contrast that he's not in North Korea, certainly not suffering. He is in Switzerland, attending a private school where a lot of upper middle class, I believe, kids and children of diplomats go to school. And he's, you know, he's living a relatively normal life, except for the fact that he's got people who attend to his every need. And when he wants a new device or something, like the newest, what was going on when I was a kid, when he wants to get the Game Boy Color as opposed to the regular old Game Boy, he can have it in the 90s. I remember when I got my first Game Boy Color, my cousin gave me a black and white Ninja Turtles game. That would have been 1994, 1995. My cousin in Tennessee, who had gotten the original Game Boy, gave me that game. Thank you, Brent, so very much. That's how I know that that's what Kim Jong Un might have been requesting in the 1990s in Switzerland. The point being that Kim Jong-il was out of the country, or Kim Jong-un was out of the country during the worst of the famine. But there's evidence from his former cook that when he came back around the year 2000, that he had some questions. Kim Jong-un asked things like, why are our people's living conditions so bad? And why is the South so prosperous? Why is, well, actually, let me take back. I think he says, why is Japan so prosperous? So after World War II, how did Japan have this economic miracle? And I am not, to be clear, setting up Kim Jong-un to be some sort of a lover of the people, liberalizer. Not at all. He's just as brutal as his father, and is just as much of a totalitarian, at the very least, as his father and grandfather. And when his father dies in 2011, Kim Jong-un does some things to prove that he is going to continue on the legacy of the dynasty. One of them is that he has his father made into the permanent general secretary or whatever. The second thing is he goes through the mourning period like Kim Jong Il does when his father dies. And he, well, here's the thing that we knew. When we knew that Kim Jong-un was going to be just as brutal and just as totalitarian as his father and grandfather. Song Tek is his uncle and is a powerful party apparatchik under Kim Jong-il. And in the lead up to his father's death, Kim Jong-un, well, actually, we don't know. It could have been Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un, initiated a purge of Jin-Sung Tek. And Kim Jong-il goes to Beijing a few times to make sure that the Hu Jintao is going to accept Kim Jong-un's ascension to power. And so Kim Jong-il is clearly wanting Kim Jong-un to be the successor. And when Kim Jong-un takes power, within a couple years, he has Jin-Sung Tek killed, executed. I've actually perpetuated a story that might not be true, where he was actually using anti-aircraft missiles to execute his uncle. The New York Times reported that. That might be untrue. But the fact that he had his uncle executed is, without a doubt, true. And this was done in his early part of his reign, even though Jin-Sung Tek was demoted within the party before Kim Jong-il died, and Kim Jong-un was actually seen with Jin-Sung Tek at the funeral procession of his father. There was this thought that maybe Jin-Sung Tek would be a power broker within Kim Jong-un's new regime, or that he would share power, or that he would help. He'd be almost like a regent for Kim Jong Un, who was particularly young at this period of time. No, within a couple of years, Kim Jong Un has his uncle killed. So I'm making a cut here because I need to write down a quote. However, when Kim Jong Un takes power, he also does a couple things that distinguishes himself from his father. So he doubles down, just like you would expect, on the cult of personality. He does some purges of like his uncle. However, in 2012, he gives a speech. He gives his first public speech. And first of all, we mentioned that Kim Jong Il didn't give a whole lot of speeches. I think he gave one in his entire time as a supreme leader. Kim Jong Un's going to give a speech in 2012. He's going to start dressing like his grandfather quite a bit. He's a little pudgy. Kim Il-sung became quite pudgy as time went on. He wore those like Mao style suits, those costumes with the gray sweats or whatever. And he starts to emulate his grandfather. And that also means this image is cultivated of him looking a lot like his grandfather and being beloved by the people in the same way Kim Il-sung was beloved. And one of the ways that he sought out to achieve that makes him distinct from his father is through the Byungin philosophy. I think the sun's coming in right now. It might be a little hard to see. Byungin. And the quote that Kim Jong-un gives in his speech, this is a public record, I looked it up. He said that for his reign, it was time for the North Koreans to not tighten belts again. That is, the days of the famine are over, and enjoy wealth and prosperity of socialism. Enjoy the wealth and prosperity of socialism. It's the Byungin philosophy. So in 2012, the new great successor is saying that we can have socialism and we can have a nuclear program, which is the second arm of Byungin. So now that we have a nuclear program, we can also relax the military first philosophy and actually just enjoy the fact that we're secure, national security wise, and that people should be able to live better lives. And so there's a couple things that I want to point out here. So let's go with the official sort of narrative of things, the common understanding of things right now. The common understanding is that when Kim Jong-un makes this announcement, that immediately he goes about a process of doing a big building boom in Pyongyang and other cities, building bars, water parks, a dolphinarium, like amusement parks, movie theaters, that basically the goal becomes to give people a better standard of living, at least the upper class, those core people that we talked about earlier, and that the material benefits of the Korean people should be prioritized, almost a rejection of Juche to a certain extent, because it's about what is physically happening in the world and trying to make that better for Korean people, as opposed to just if you can dream it, you can make it reality, or whatever that Kim Il-sung was going at. And one of the things that people always reference when they're talking about this change is like, oh, Kim Jong-un had like a water slide built, and there's this famous image of him like inspecting a water slide at a water park with like multiple colors of slides. I have a small thing to point out here, though, is that I actually have watched a propaganda video, and I'll try to put up a couple seconds of it here, where Kim Jong-il has made a film, and he is talking, it's a propaganda film. There's Mount Paektu at the beginning, as we'd expect, that legendary mountain. And then there is a couple lines about how Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung wanted to make lives better for people. And so Kim Jong-il helped Kim Il-sung build some water entertainment for the people. And there's an image of water slides. So the idea that this is a totally new innovation, not true. Because I am going to put up B-roll of something from like the 90s where they're already having this conversation. However, it's becoming, the evidence says that this is becoming much more real in the era of Kim Jong-un, that you can find a lot more black markets, that you can physically see, like people who go to Pyongyang say there's a lot more construction that's been happening, and there's a lot, like prosperity is kind of emerging. There is a standard of living that is increasing, and that Kim Jong-un is part of this. And I've seen it almost posited as though like Kim Jong-un is actually a reformer, an opener up a little bit of North Korea. I think that's taking it a little too far, particularly when you think about the fact that the totalitarian regime overall of this remains, and that, you know, if Kim Jong-un's sister, who's currently the most obvious person to replace him when he dies, even though he's still relatively young, he does have some health issues that would make us think that maybe his sister would take power sooner rather than later. Anyway, all this can be taken away because the totalitarian regime is still there, right? So there's a sense that there's a new generation, the millennial generation of North Koreans who are less interested in the propaganda of the cult of personality, are more interested in South Korean films. There's been a crackdown on people who bring in films, distribute films, watch films from South Korea on like portable DVD players in North Korea. There is still strict control on things, like even though there are mobile phones in North Korea now for some of the core class, that there's an intranet, not an internet, just for North Korea with government approved and created websites. So, you know, if I had to describe it, I'd say it almost looks a little bit more like, it looks a little bit more like East Germany, or maybe the better example is probably like the China under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. That was a little bit more open, but still the monopoly of power in those places resided nonetheless with the Communist Party. And even though material benefits continue to increase in China under Xi Jinping, the liberalization projects, any political liberalization has been clawed back aggressively. And in Kim Jong Un's case, the political liberalization, even relatively speaking, has never occurred. And nonetheless, there's these material benefits that make Kim Jong Un different from his father and grandfather, at least the later years of Kim Il-sung. And then, you know, Kim Jong Il, basically until his death, like North Korea was just, you know, on the brink of collapse. A couple more points I want to make about Kim Jong Un deal with foreign policy. The nuclear testing continues. So after his father died, there's nuclear tests. There's some sort of bare bones agreement with the Obama administration for aid for suspending plutonium enrichment. And then immediately, like literally weeks later, they launch a satellite in quotes. A lot of people think it was an ICBM test. So everything falls apart. Kim Jong Un is testing nukes, is testing new longer range missiles, things that can go 4,000, 6,000 miles, things that could actually hit the United States. There's a propaganda image posted of him and his generals looking at different targets in the USA to possibly hit. So the nuclear program is full steam ahead. And you might be wondering, oh, what about the era of Donald Trump? Didn't they meet in 2018? And the answer is yes. They exchanged threats. If you remember, the fire and fury quote from Trump on Twitter back in the day, saying that, you know, if North Korea doesn't watch out, fire and fury is coming. He talked about having a bigger nuclear button than Kim Jong Un. I don't know what that was referring to in figurative terms. And he called him Little Rocket Man or something at the UN General Assembly. And it really felt like things were in really bad shape at that moment. But then Kim Jong-il and Trump actually had a meeting in 2018. Trump did his bow to the North Korean general, and they became friends. They met again in 2019 in Hanoi, and then they actually had an exchange at the DMZ that same year, where President Trump became the first American president to step foot in North Korea. Pretty extraordinary, except that there is no evidence whatsoever that this did anything to deter North Korea from developing its nuclear weapons program. That it continued to roll ahead, testing continued, and there was basically no step back whatsoever. No concrete things were agreed. The only thing that we can say is that the personal animosity between the two was gone, and they became friends afterward. Very goofy. And so the answer is that the nuclear program is full steam ahead in the Kim Jong-un years, despite anything that might appear to the contrary through the Trump negotiations. There's basically been no change. And now it's almost just like an acceptance around the, you know, across the board that North Korea is a nuclear state. That gives the regime a lot of confidence and a lot of stability, which leads me to my last point about Kim Jong-un as we approach the present, which is that Kim Jong-un has picked up the baton of triangulation between what's now Russia and China in the tradition of his father and his grandfather. There are these images of Kim Jong-un in 2018. Before he met Trump, he actually met Xi Jinping. You know, there was this feeling that the only reason that China was allowing North Korea to still exist in like the 90s and 2000s and 2010s was because they didn't want an American proxy state in South Korea on their Chinese border. And so it was just enough help for whatever North Korea needed to not collapse and nothing more. But then there's this meeting where Kim Jong-un goes to China and sees Xi before Kim Jong-un meets President Trump. And who knows what sort of things were exchanged there. And then a year later, in 2019, Kim Jong-un makes his first visit to Russia. And then Vladimir Putin comes to Pyongyang. And then later on in 2022, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine, and in 2023, Kim Jong Un praises that invasion and promises assistance to Vladimir Putin. First, it was ammunition, and literally it became soldiers, North Korean soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine, of all places. And you start to see this triangulation again, because now, in this year, in September, there was the 80th anniversary parade of the Chinese victory over Japan in World War II. And Xi Jinping, for his parade, he's the one wearing his Mao costume, and Kim Jong Un is invited wearing a Western suit. And to the right, if I remember the order of Xi Jinping, is Vladimir Putin. And so there's this trifecta going on. And you know, we could talk about the wider reasons why this tripartite alliance makes a lot of sense, but this is probably the closest these three powers have been since ever. It's kind of incredible, actually. And I think when you look at the modern North Korean state, you should look at actually a state that's acting pretty confident. Kim Jong Un's been in power for over a decade. He's clearly improved relations with China. He's improved relations with Vladimir Putin in Russia. He's making public appearances in a way that Xi Jinping wants him by his side in some of his most, publicly facing moments. This is something that would never have occurred under Mao. Never would have occurred under Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao. The Soviet relations with North Korea ebbed and flowed as well. The Khrushchev era, you can't imagine it. Stalin, always wanted to be top dog. And anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that, like, Kim Jong Un is actually probably, if appearance is reality, he's probably the most savvy of the three. I mean, geopolitically speaking, Kim Il-sung was a master navigator, obviously a guerrilla fighter. He is the founder of North Korea, so you can't write him off. Kim Jong Il has often been written off as a weirdo, but as I think we've established, he basically made his cult of personality, his one-man totalitarian dictatorship, survive on life support at the true bottom of global communism. So I don't think we can write off Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong Il either. But Kim Jong Un is looking very confident, and the only things that we can say is that internally, there's concerns in North Korea about the escape of information, about the proliferation of media, and having control over a very rudimentary intranet instead of the internet. But Kim Jong Un is leading a. Sorry, I keep saying obviously my brain's getting a little tired here, but when you think back to the early days of Kim Jong Un, when he had Dennis Rodman in town 3-4 times, the Chicago Bulls star from the 90s. The only reason that stopped is because Dennis Rodman started acting like a crazy drunk person. But that was a bit of swagger from Kim Jong Un early in his regime, to be having celebrities and powerful people come to him, and then to open up North Korea a little bit to black markets, and to continue to push on this nuclear program until a point where he and his regime feel secure enough to go around and be confident on the world stage with Xi and Trump and Putin, to meet and smile with South Korea's President Moon, if I'm not mistaken. I think that far from collapsing, we should be looking at a moment where North Korea is fitting quite well into this illiberal world that's developing, where modern democracy, contrary to the expectation that the fall of the wall in 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union marked the end of history, that actually, no, liberal democracy right now is in a really difficult moment, and North Korea is fitting quite well into this illiberal world. Fukuyama, if you read The End of History, which I did in undergrad, so it's been a while, but actually people always dunk on him as being like, it wasn't the end of history, bro. Like, obviously liberal democracy was going to see challenges again. Autocracy and dictatorships weren't over. Fukuyama didn't argue literally that it was the end of history. It was just saying that this is the moment when liberal democracy was ascendant, and that, their challenges might come. So that was never his thesis, but we're getting a little off topic here. I think we should consider the flexibility of North Korea under a single man depends on how flexible that man is. And so Kim Jong Il was highly inflexible, and it's honestly a testament to just how horrific the cult of personality was and the control of the totalitarianism. The fact that there's overlapping state security agencies like the Ministry of State Security and the Ministry of Social Security that run these prison camps, that there's that there's really no checks and balances whatsoever, even within the party state. So there's no consultative Leninism like you would find in China under Xi Jinping. There's no liberal wing. There's no conservative wing that we know of. There's just this one-man rule. And so Kim Jong Un looks, contrary to expectation, to be quite a nimble navigator. He and his sister seem to be quite good at building soft power around the world. And so therefore the North Korean regime is looking pretty flexible right now. But on the other hand, history can move in another direction, and there's no guarantee that our illiberal moment will last forever. And the open question will be, what will North Korea do in that period afterwards? A lot comes down to the personalities. Like I said, if Kim Jong Un doesn't live a long and prosperous life because of some of his weight issues, then maybe his sister will take over, and we don't know. There's a biography called The Sister that came out a couple of years ago on his sister, whose name evades me at the moment, but she doesn't seem to be a particularly liberal lady. So we could expect that if she were to take power, she'd be just as brutal. And so the relative opening up under Un might end. So I'm going to put a full list of sources below, but before we wrapped up, I did want to just hold up on the screen. These are the sources. God, that sun's bright. These are the sources that were the most important to me. I'll list them first in the description that helped me in this. I do not have an encyclopedic memory. I have lots of notes here. I read a lot of books to help me. I've got, like, this is one of the books on Kim Jong Un, the great successor, that I was reading. Yes, he's wearing sunglasses on the cover. But, Accidental Tyrant was important to me. Exit Emperor Kim was important to me. Becoming Kim Jong Un was actually particularly useful for understanding all three of these men, even though it's ostensibly a biography on Kim Jong Un. So there's an intellectual background here, and because North Korea is so closed, the work that these people do to look at archives in other countries, for example, to look at like the Soviet archives when they were opened in the 90s and determine things about North Korea, incredibly important. And so I don't want to end this video without saying thank you to those who did the intellectual work to allow me to make a video like this and talk for a long period of time about North Korea. Quick personal note from me: if you enjoyed this long explication, if you've been here this whole time and you've seen me slowly lose my energy and make mistakes and talk to my cat and all that, I appreciate you so much. The best way that you can support me in this endeavor is to go to patreon.com/WilliamCFox and become a patron. If you'd like to get personal access to me, that's the best way to do it behind the scenes. Alternatively, if you'd like to get access to some bonus content, you can follow me on Substack and subscribe there as a paid subscriber. That's $8 a month, though I keep most of my Substack content not behind the paywall, to be honest. I consider that place a place to be a little bit more open, even though paid subscriptions are absolutely like normal there. So I really appreciate you if you've watched it this far. As you can tell, I'm exhausted, so I will just say, heads held high, happy warriors. Later, y'all.